Across remote mountains, frozen valleys, and shadowed caves, the people we rely on to save lives have sometimes vanished themselves, swallowed by landscapes that offer no mercy or explanation. Search and rescue teams, trained for the harshest conditions, have stepped into storms, avalanches, and labyrinthine wildernesses, and disappeared without warning, leaving only traces that hint at impossible events. These are missions meant to find the lost, yet in these cases the hunters became the missing. As you follow the paths of these vanished rescuers, you will traverse icy ridges of Alaska, labyrinthine caves in Thailand, and windswept crags in the Scottish Highlands. You will witness the haunting remains of expeditions interrupted, the enigmatic signs left behind in snow and rock, and the unnerving silence of forests and cliffs that defied even the most seasoned teams. Each story reveals not just danger, but the fragile boundary between human skill and nature's relentless hidden power. The Dyatlov retrieval that never reported back. The Ural Mountains hold a silence that seems to absorb sound before it can travel far, and in the winter of 1959 that silence deepened when a search and rescue group sent to locate 9 missing hikers encountered conditions so severe that, for a brief and troubling period, they too seemed to vanish into the same white emptiness. The Dyatlov Pass incident is remembered for the unexplained deaths of the hiking party led by Igor Dyatlov, yet less attention is given to the first retrieval teams who entered that landscape and failed to report back on schedule. In those early days, uncertainty spread beyond the lost students and into the ranks of those sent to find them. Concern began when the hikers did not send their expected telegram to the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. Their route toward Otorten Mountain had been planned meticulously, and Dyatlov had indicated he would contact the institute upon returning to Vizhai. When no message arrived by mid-February, relatives and classmates pressed officials to organise a search. On February 20th, volunteer teams composed of fellow students and instructors departed for the northern Urals, an isolated region of deep snow, sub-zero temperatures, and vast coniferous forest. They travelled by train and truck as far as possible, then continued on skis toward the last known point of the expedition. From the beginning, communication proved fragile. The searchers relied on intermittent radio transmissions, relayed through settlements and forestry posts, and the mountainous terrain often interfered with reception. Military units soon joined the effort, deploying aircraft and additional personnel. Yet, for a span of critical hours during one of the early sweeps, reports from a forward group failed to arrive at their expected interval. In the volatile winter weather of the northern Urals, such silence could mean equipment failure, disorientation, or something far worse. Anxiety built among coordinators waiting for confirmation that their own searchers had not succumbed to the same fate. Snowstorms in the region can rise without warning, and visibility can collapse into a featureless white horizon. The slopes near Kholat Syakhl, later translated as Dead Mountain, offer little natural shelter, and wind can carve the snow into deceptive drifts that obscure tracks within minutes. The volunteer searchers navigating these ridges had to interpret faint ski trails buried under fresh accumulation, all while preserving their own strength in temperatures that often fell below -30 degrees Celsius. When their scheduled communication lapsed, command posts faced the possibility that 2 separate groups were now lost in the same wilderness. Eventually, contact resumed, but the interruption revealed how precarious the operation had become. Even trained rescuers could be reduced to uncertainty by terrain that concealed direction and distance. The first breakthrough occurred on February 26th, when searchers located the hikers' abandoned tent on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. The discovery immediately deepened the mystery. The tent had been cut open from the inside, and personal belongings, including boots and warm clothing, remained inside despite the brutal cold. For the rescuers standing there, the scene must have suggested sudden panic or an unseen threat. Not far from the tent, the search teams found the first bodies, lying in socks or barefoot on the snow. 2 were discovered beneath a cedar tree at the forest's edge, remnants of a small fire nearby. Others were located along a line that appeared to trace a desperate attempt to return to the tent. The searchers had to document and recover these remains while still confronting the unstable snowpack and relentless weather. Each step risked triggering a slab of wind-hardened snow, and each night spent in the open exposed them to the same lethal cold that had claimed the hikers. As the recovery continued into March and April, additional bodies were uncovered in a ravine buried beneath meters of snow. 4 of the victims exhibited severe internal injuries, including fractured ribs and skull trauma, injuries that investigators later compared to the force of a car crash. The rescuers tasked with extracting these bodies worked in terrain that shifted with the thaw, where melting snow altered footing and concealed hazards. It was during one of these extended searches that communication once again faltered, and a retrieval unit reportedly failed to signal its position before nightfall. Archival records from the investigation describe the complexity of coordinating volunteers, military personnel, and local Mansi guides across an immense and inhospitable landscape. Helicopters were used to transport equipment and survey the slopes, but the weather frequently grounded flights. Ground teams operated on skis carrying supplies through drifts that reached waist height. When one detachment did not report back at the expected hour, supervisors had to weigh the risk of sending additional teams into deteriorating conditions. For a tense interval, uncertainty spread through the command structure, echoing the original disappearance that had prompted the mission. The northern Urals are not only remote but also deceptive in scale. Distances that appear manageable on maps can expand into grueling treks when snow obscures landmarks. Compasses can be influenced by local magnetic anomalies caused by mineral deposits, a detail noted in some geological surveys of the region. For searchers already fatigued, slight navigational errors could compound rapidly. A missed ridge or misjudged bearing might place them in terrain where radio contact weakened, reinforcing fears that the rescuers themselves were slipping beyond the reach of coordination. Despite these obstacles, the retrieval operation ultimately accounted for all 9 members of the Dyatlov group. The rescuers who experienced communication breakdowns were located and returned, but the episode underscored how thin the margin for survival had been. Investigative files closed the criminal inquiry in May 1959, citing an unknown compelling force of nature as the cause of death. Decades later, in 2020, Russian authorities reopened and reviewed the case, concluding that a slab avalanche likely forced the hikers to flee their tent. Yet even this explanation leaves questions about timing and behaviour. For the search teams, the ordeal did not end with recovery. They had stood in the same wind-scoured clearing, felt the same freezing air against exposed skin, and recognised how swiftly order could dissolve into chaos. Their temporary disappearance from contact, however brief in official timelines, mirrored the hikers' silence that had first alarmed families in Sverdlovsk. In that vast expanse of snow and stone, lines between rescuer and victim blurred, bound by geography that offered little mercy and less clarity. Testimonies from participants describe exhaustion, frostbite, and the psychological weight of traversing a site already marked by unexplained tragedy. The act of searching became an exercise in endurance against both environment and uncertainty. Each recovered body intensified the need for answers, yet each mile travelled revealed how easily even organised teams could be isolated by weather and terrain. The retrieval that nearly failed to report back remains a quiet footnote in the broader narrative, overshadowed by speculation but inseparable from the same conditions. Long after the last helicopter departed and the snow reclaimed the disturbed ground, the slopes of Kolatsiakl retained their reputation for stark indifference. The Dyatlov Pass incident continues to draw researchers, climbers, and historians seeking clarity, but the reality of those early search days remains grounded in documented fact. Communication faltered, visibility collapsed, and trained rescuers faced the possibility of becoming another lost group in the northern wilderness. For a moment, the mountains seemed ready to claim them as well, and in that narrow window of silence, it was impossible to know whether the search for the missing had simply become another disappearance. The Oregon Crater Lake Winter Deployment. Winter closes in on Crater Lake with a kind of quiet finality, sealing roads, muting sound, and narrowing movement to only those prepared to navigate its snowbound interior. In one documented winter deployment, a forward search and rescue unit operating along the rim temporarily lost contact during a whiteout, raising concern that the rescuers themselves had become disoriented inside the caldera. Crater Lake National Park, located in southern Oregon, is widely known for its extraordinary snowfall, which routinely ranks among the highest recorded annual totals in the United States. When storms settle over the basin, access shrinks to snowcats, skis, and radios, that must compete with wind, cold, and terrain. Snowfall in this region often exceeds 40 feet in a single season, burying the rim drive beneath drifts that can rise well above vehicle height. The park closes most roads during winter, and only limited facilities remain operational, staffed by rangers trained in avalanche awareness and cold weather response. Snow reshapes familiar terrain into a uniform surface where signs, guardrails, and trail markers disappear beneath accumulation. What appears level may conceal a sharp drop toward the caldera wall, and what seems like stable ground may slope gradually toward the lake's edge, masked by wind-packed layers that erase visual cues. The deployment was initiated after an overdue winter visitor failed to return at the expected time, prompting rangers to evaluate storm forecasts and remaining daylight. Winter recreation at Crater Lake includes snowshoeing and cross-country skiing, activities that attract experienced backcountry travelers even when conditions deteriorate quickly. Delays in reporting can compress the window for effective search operations, particularly when fresh snowfall threatens to obscure tracks and landmarks. Rangers assembled a forward unit equipped with handheld radios, compasses, topographic maps, and insulated emergency supplies, planning to sweep sections of the rim where recent movement had been reported. Cloud cover thickened as the team advanced, and within a short span the horizon dissolved into a diffuse glare that eliminated contrast between sky and snow. Whiteout conditions occur when scattered light removes shadows and depth perception, flattening the landscape into a disorienting field of pale brightness. Under these circumstances, even gradual inclines can feel abrupt, and distances become difficult to judge accurately. The caldera's circular form offers few linear anchors once snow conceals the rim drive's curvature, forcing rescuers to rely heavily on instrument readings rather than instinctive visual reference. Radio protocol required scheduled check-ins at fixed intervals, allowing command staff to monitor progress and adjust strategy. When one transmission window passed without reply from the forward unit assigned to a sector near the rim, repeated calls produced only static. Mountainous terrain can interrupt radio signals, and extreme cold can shorten battery life, yet the timing unsettled those listening at the operations post. Silence during an active deployment compresses attention toward worst-case possibilities. Each unanswered call extended the uncertainty, creating a widening gap between expectation and confirmation. Wind intensified across the open expanse of the lake, funneling upward toward the rim and carrying fine snow that reduced visibility even further. Sound in such conditions behaves irregularly. Voices can seem displaced, and mechanical noise can vanish beneath gusts that reshape drifts in minutes. Rescuers moving in staggered formation must maintain visual contact to avoid separation, yet visibility had narrowed to only a few meters. The basin's acoustics, shaped by steep caldera walls, offered no clear guidance as to direction or distance. Orientation depended on disciplined pacing and constant instrument verification. Subtle shifts in terrain began to complicate navigation, as drifting snow concealed minor elevation changes and masked the precise boundary between road and slope. The rim drive, which forms a near-continuous loop around the lake during accessible seasons, becomes indistinguishable from adjacent terrain once ploughed paths disappear. Compass bearings must be checked repeatedly, but even precise headings can lead across terrain that appears identical in every direction. Ski tracks laid moments earlier can be erased by wind, removing the simplest means of retracing movement and reinforcing the risk of gradual drift. Avalanche risk, while not extreme on every section of the rim, remained a constant calculation in winter operations at Crater Lake, particularly along slopes where wind-loaded snow accumulates unevenly. Rangers are trained to assess cornice formation near the caldera edge, where overhanging snow can extend beyond solid ground and collapse without visible warning. In whiteout conditions, identifying these fragile overhangs becomes significantly more difficult as depth perception fades and surface texture flattens. The forward unit had to adjust spacing and probe uncertain ground carefully, aware that a misjudged step near the rim could trigger not only a fall, but a secondary emergency. Temperature readings continued to drop as the afternoon advanced, increasing the strain on exposed skin and battery-powered equipment alike. Cold affects radio efficiency and can dull tactile sensitivity, making fine adjustments to navigation tools more difficult. Gloves must be removed briefly to manipulate controls, yet even short exposure invites numbness. The physical demands of winter travel accumulate quietly, draining energy reserves while attention remains fixed on direction. In such an environment, minor technical issues can compound into operational setbacks that widen the margin between control and vulnerability. At the command post, supervisors weighed whether to dispatch a secondary unit while monitoring real-time weather data from park instruments. Deploying additional personnel could re-establish contact or create a second emergency if conditions worsen. Snowcats require careful coordination, and response time is shaped by visibility, terrain, and fuel logistics. The possibility that the forward unit had veered towards sections of the rim with steep drop-offs added urgency. Yet restraint remained essential, as overextension during severe weather can fracture even well-planned operations into fragmented, overlapping searches. Minutes extended into a tense interval before a fragmented transmission finally cut through the static. The forward unit reported difficulty maintaining a consistent bearing and acknowledged that they had unintentionally arced off their intended line while compensating for wind. Course correction required halting movement, regrouping and re-establishing alignment using compass headings and partially visible tree clusters that emerged briefly between gusts. No injuries were reported, but the lapse underscored how incremental navigational error can accumulate under whiteout conditions. The caldera's symmetry had subtly redirected movement without immediate detection. Crater Lake's geological origins add dimension to its winter hazards. Approximately 7,700 years ago, the eruption and collapse of Mount Mazama formed the caldera that now holds the lake, creating steep inner walls that descend sharply toward deep water. The lake measures nearly 6 miles across and reaches depths of about 1,943 feet. During winter storms, these dramatic contours are concealed beneath layers of snow and cloud. A landscape born from catastrophic transformation retains structural severity, even when softened visually by seasonal accumulation. What unsettled those involved in the deployment was not the scale of distance travelled, but the realization that containment does not equate to predictability. The forward unit had operated within a defined boundary, encircled by a mapped road and monitored by park infrastructure. Yet a combination of light diffusion, wind, and topography had eroded situational clarity. The original search for the overdue visitor resumed once conditions stabilized, but the temporary silence lingered in operational memory as a reminder that disorientation can arise within even well-charted terrain. In winter, Crater Lake appears serene from above, a vast white ring framing still water, yet beneath that appearance lies a complex interaction of weather, geology, and human perception. The deployment concluded without loss, and communication systems were reviewed to reduce future risk, but the incident revealed how swiftly certainty can thin in a snowbound basin. Even experienced rescuers, equipped and trained for such environments, found themselves briefly untethered from reliable reference inside a natural amphitheatre of wind and light. For a measured span of storm and static, the searchers discovered how easily a closed circle can become a place, without direction. The Mount Hood helicopter disappearance. A brittle chill settled over the early morning air, folding clouds into twisting shapes and blurring distinctions between shadow and light. Pilots checked instruments repeatedly, aware that the fog could erase the difference between safe altitude and treacherous terrain. A search and rescue helicopter had taken off to locate a missing climber, yet soon even this trained team would vanish from radar and sight. Each gust of wind, each reflection on ice or snow added uncertainty to the operation. Controllers on the ground monitored instruments and radio, realizing that the mountain's unpredictability could claim both mission and crew in mere minutes. Snow and ice swirled in turbulent eddies as gusts tore along ridges, stirring drifts that made slopes and cliffs appear inconsistent and misleading from above. Rotorwash added its own chaos, lifting powder into moving sheets that changed the visual landscape by the second. Pilots had to continually compensate for wind shear and vertical drafts, trusting both instinct and instruments. The combination of environmental forces required constant adjustments in pitch, speed, and heading. Even slight miscalculations could carry the aircraft closer to unseen crevasses or abrupt elevation changes. Each second demanded focus. Every decision amplified the stakes in the frigid mountain air. The flight plan was meticulous, designed with pre-planned grids, scheduled check-ins and instrument cross-checks, yet all procedures depended on visibility and reliable communication. As clouds thickened, each scheduled radio call carried mounting anxiety. Operators understood that delays could be inconsequential or catastrophic, yet they had little way to judge which. Backup protocols, including beacon activation and predefined search corridors, offered minimal reassurance when visibility dropped below thresholds that pilots could safely navigate. The combination of urgency and uncertainty heightened pressure in the cockpit, demanding careful decision-making while maintaining a steady course over terrain that could appear benign one moment and dangerous the next. Ice began forming on rotor blades almost imperceptibly, threatening lift efficiency while atmospheric pressure fluctuations introduced subtle errors in altitude readings. Pilots had to constantly recalibrate, noting even minor deviations and cross-checking multiple instruments while adjusting speed and angle of ascent. Snow and frost on sensor panels occasionally reduced responsiveness, forcing crew members to rely partially on judgment under adverse conditions. While mechanical monitoring indicated stability, the combination of environmental and human factors meant that a small misalignment could escalate rapidly. Each adjustment consumed mental bandwidth and fuel, both precious in a high-altitude remote search environment. Minutes stretched as radio silence persisted, filling the command post with tension and speculation. Repeated attempts at contact produced fragments of static, forcing operators to analyze partial information and consider multiple potential scenarios. The lack of confirmation magnified uncertainty, turning routine procedures into high-stakes guesswork. Historical patterns of rapid weather change in the area informed their caution, yet did not reduce the unease. Each unanswered interval expanded the realm of possibilities, leaving both flight crews and controllers acutely aware that even small errors could result in serious consequences. Every moment of silence was a reminder of the mountain's invisible reach. Sunlight reflected erratically off snow and ice, creating optical illusions that distorted spatial perception and flattened depth cues. Cliffs, gullies and ridgelines appeared differently depending on angle and wind direction. Pilots were forced to rely on both instruments and visual judgment, navigating a constantly shifting landscape where errors could cascade. Even minor misperceptions could lead to directional drift or an unplanned descent toward hidden hazards. The dynamic interplay of light, snow and shadow created a disorienting environment where technical skill and experience were challenged by natural optical deception. Cloud shadows and shifting reflections introduced additional confusion, producing phantom ridges and imaginary crevasses. Pilots reported the sensation of flying through a three-dimensional maze that continuously rearranged itself. These visual distortions required constant course corrections and adjustments, consuming time and fuel while adding psychological pressure. Minor deviations accumulated almost imperceptibly, gradually steering the helicopter off its planned path without immediate detection. The crew was trapped between instrument guidance and deceptive visual cues, balancing technical precision against human interpretation of a rapidly transforming environment. Inside the cockpit, fatigue, altitude, and the relentless cold pressed on both cognitive and physical capacities. Each decision demanded rapid evaluation of multiple variables: wind shifts, visibility, ice accumulation, and fuel consumption. Crew members alternated scanning instruments and clouds, communicating adjustments over the rotor's persistent roar. High-altitude stress can slow reaction times and dull tactile response, transforming ordinary tasks into tense challenges. Maintaining situational awareness became as much a test of endurance as skill. Every maneuver carried heightened consequences, as even minor miscalculations could produce cascading operational problems in the unforgiving airspace above the mountain. Command center coordinators faced the difficult task of interpreting sparse, intermittent data, weighing the risks of sending additional aircraft into the same hazardous conditions. Every radar blip and fragmentary signal was scrutinized for potential significance. Dispatch decisions had to account for wind, elevation, cloud cover, and the potential for further accidents. Operators balanced urgency with caution, aware that rash action could worsen the situation. The combination of technical, environmental, and human factors created a tense atmosphere where uncertainty dominated each calculation. magnifying the stakes of every decision. Observers attempted to trace the helicopter's intended flight paths from multiple perspectives, employing binoculars, infrared, and topographical reference points. Yet sudden shifts in cloud and wind rendered large portions of the search area effectively invisible. Even high-resolution equipment could not penetrate thick fog, while temperature inversions affected infrared readings. Ground teams faced their own limitations. Deep snow, hidden slopes, and avalanche-prone areas complicated synchronized search efforts. The complexity of combined aerial and ground operations added to the sense that the helicopter could have vanished entirely, leaving no visible trace for rescuers to follow. Historical records reinforced the sense of vulnerability, illustrating how abrupt microclimates and mechanical strain have repeatedly challenged aircraft on Mount Hood. Past incidents underscored the mountain's ability to produce conditions beyond predictive thresholds. Even modern helicopters with highly trained crews can fall prey to sudden turbulence, ice accumulation, and cloud-driven disorientation. These recurring patterns highlighted the unpredictable nature of aerial operations in this environment, emphasizing that technical proficiency and careful planning cannot guarantee safety. The disappearance of this crew demonstrated how quickly a routine rescue can become a situation with no clear solution or explanation. Despite extensive sweeps, instrument monitoring, and repeated attempts at locating the helicopter, no definitive position was confirmed. Operators faced partial data and growing apprehension as the team's absence extended beyond expected intervals. Command personnel grappled with the tension between hope and plausible danger, aware that every moment without confirmation increased the risk of tragedy. Snow and clouds, shifting rapidly over ridges and slopes, obscured both potential debris and visual confirmation. Even after hours of searching, the helicopter remained unverified, its fate a stark reminder of how quickly modern technology can be neutralized by environmental unpredictability. By the afternoon, controllers and pilots alike recognized that nature had claimed temporary control of the operation. The combination of weather, visual distortion, and mechanical limitation rendered the helicopter effectively invisible in real time. Procedures, skill, and technology could only mitigate risk. They could not eliminate the mountain's capacity for sudden, disruptive change. Even the most advanced instruments were challenged by fog, turbulence, and ice, while human perception struggled against optical illusions and the stress of uncertainty. The incident remained a stark testament to how aerial search and rescue, despite precision and preparation, can be rendered helpless by conditions that evolve faster than response. Above turbulent air and shifting clouds, the helicopter became part of a sky where even experience, instruments, and procedure could not guarantee it remained within reach of the world below. The Thai cave diver who didn't surface. Dripping echoes bounced off the limestone walls of a remote cave in northern Thailand, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and stagnant air. Pools of water reflected fractured beams from the diver's helmet light as he progressed deeper into the submerged passages. The search and rescue diver had entered this system to locate a trapped spelunker, yet within moments signals from the team grew irregular, leaving surface operators unsure whether the mission was succeeding or if the cave itself had claimed another life. The darkness pressed in from all sides, punctuated only by the muted pulse of lights on wet stone and swirling water. Jagged rock formations twisted unpredictably beneath low ceilings, funneling air into confined pockets and water into narrow channels, while submerged drops appeared without warning. Each bend obscured the next, forcing the diver to navigate using both tactile awareness and limited visibility from helmet lamps. Even with guide ropes in place, the subterranean passages created a sense of dislocation, as if the cave had folded in on itself. The rushing of water in the side chambers and the occasional echo of a distant splash added auditory confusion, masking depth and distance. Every moment demanded precision, as errors could be fatal in the confined, fluid environment. Preparation had been exhaustive. Oxygen tanks, regulators, dive lines, and redundant lighting were checked meticulously, following strict procedures for complex underwater caves. But each meter deeper magnified isolation, and every decision carried high stakes. Divers were trained for emergencies, yet the unpredictability of submerged labyrinths meant that even well-planned operations could become a trial of endurance and judgment. The diver's helmet light flickered occasionally against water-streaked rock, offering fleeting glimpses of the maze ahead and serving as a fragile tether to both physical and psychological orientation. Silt rose at the slightest movement, clouding vision and erasing familiar reference points. Even slow, deliberate fin strokes stirred sediment into an opaque fog that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Navigation became a matter of instinct and experience, with a single misjudged motion capable of plunging the diver into complete disorientation. Lines previously trusted to indicate direction occasionally shifted under currents or snagged in sharp rock formations, demanding constant attention. The cave seemed to resist progress, as if it were aware of intrusions and intended to mislead those who dared enter its submerged depths. Equipment was both a lifeline and a limitation. Regulators required constant monitoring, tanks contained only finite air, and buoyancy control needed careful adjustments to avoid collisions with the ceiling or floor. Lights dimmed in cold water, and masks occasionally fogged, further complicating the task of reading instruments. Every interaction with gear consumed both physical energy and mental bandwidth. Even a momentary lapse could have cascading effects, as small errors accumulated into life-threatening problems in a cave environment where rescue was far from immediate. Although the teams prepared meticulously, cave diving safety systems had inherent vulnerabilities that tested even the most disciplined teams. Redundant air tanks and bailout systems could only prolong survival for a limited time, and reel lines used for navigation risked tangling in narrow passages or being obscured by stirred silt. Helmets and lights provided essential guidance, yet batteries and mechanical parts could fail unexpectedly under prolonged pressure and cold water. Surface teams trained to anticipate contingencies, yet each additional precaution introduced new complexity. The balance between redundancy and reliability became another invisible challenge in a system already governed by the cave's unforgiving environment. Communication lines with the surface faltered as the diver descended deeper. Tethered ropes occasionally snagged or transmitted unclear signals, leaving operators guessing whether silence indicated caution, technical malfunction, or imminent danger. Radio equipment, limited by both range and water interference, offered only intermittent reassurance. Surface personnel had to interpret every pulse and vibration, while knowing that the diver's progress through twisting tunnels could render line signals unreliable. The uncertainty grew with every meter, highlighting the fragile link between those above and the diver below. Psychological and physiological strain mounted as the diver pushed forward. Cold water, tight passages, and the weight of air tanks amplified stress, while oxygen levels and exertion influenced both judgment and reaction. Claustrophobia, even in trained professionals, became a subtle but potent hazard, compounded by the absence of natural light and the relentless pressure of the surrounding rock. Heart rates accelerated, attention wavered, and every decision required conscious effort to suppress instinctive panic. The cave environment transformed the diver's body and mind into tools of endurance, each vulnerable to the slightest misstep. Passages constricted sharply, demanding precise movements to avoid scraping equipment or becoming wedged. Vertical drops and sudden underwater chambers turned navigation into a continuous series of calculated risks, where minor miscalculations could trap a diver against rock or in a submerged crevice. Even with guidelines and pre-measured distances, the unpredictable flow of water shifted sediment and occasionally moved rocks, altering routes and creating new hazards in real time. Each chamber revealed another layer of complexity, forcing the diver to remain hyper-aware of surroundings while managing air, orientation and momentum. Secondary divers and surface teams executed detailed search procedures, following pre-planned grids and entering tunnels sequentially. Strong currents, turbid water, and limited visibility slowed progress, making coordinated rescues almost impossible without precise knowledge of the missing diver's path. Teams had to navigate not only the physical constraints of the cave, but also their own equipment limitations, ensuring they did not create additional hazards for themselves or the missing diver. Every step became a negotiation between urgency and caution, each decision underscoring the precarious balance of risk in such operations. Historical records emphasized recurring hazards in Thailand's submerged caves: silty channels, narrow squeezes, sudden surges, and hidden chambers that could entrap even the most experienced divers. Multiple incidents demonstrated that even careful planning could be undone by minor currents, equipment failure, or disorientation. These patterns underscored the fragile margin between success and catastrophe in underwater cave rescues. The diver's disappearance aligned with these known challenges, reinforcing that natural forces, not error alone, often dictated outcomes in subterranean search missions. Despite repeated sweeps and attempts to locate the diver visually or via line markers, the mission yielded no confirmation. Surface operators and fellow divers faced tense, extended uncertainty, aware that the diver might be trapped in sections impossible to reach quickly. Every passing minute stretched hope thinner, while teams adjusted strategies and communicated contingencies. Each unsuccessful attempt amplified the sense that the cave was both labyrinth and captor, a system that operated independently of human skill or intent. Obstructions multiplied. Collapsing walls, swirling silt, and turbulent currents delayed rescue and distorted perception. Channels that had seemed navigable became impassable without exact knowledge of their contours. Every turn carried uncertainty, and every submerged drop could conceal new dangers. Even with detailed cave maps and prior experience, rescuers had to move cautiously, acknowledging that the environment could render preparation insufficient. Each obstacle heightened suspense, making the diver's absence increasingly mysterious, and the cave's labyrinthine power more apparent. Though trained, equipped, and experienced, the divers were at the mercy of a system that operated on its own terms. Water-filled tunnels, tight squeezes, and sudden vertical drops left no guarantees, and the missing diver's fate remained unknown, suspended in the cave's dark, twisting passages. Every technical advantage, every safety precaution, every human instinct could be neutralized by the cave's subtle and relentless constraints, leaving only questions and the pressing awareness of nature's indifference. In the submerged labyrinth of northern Thailand, even skill, preparation, and advanced equipment could vanish as if the cave itself had decided the diver would never surface. The Great Smoky Mountains Tracker Case. Mist rose from the damp forest floor, curling between tree trunks and clinging to moss-covered roots, transforming familiar trails into a shadowed labyrinth. Every sound was amplified, leaves snapping underfoot, distant bird calls, and the faint rush of water through hidden streams. A search and rescue team had entered the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee to locate a missing hiker, carefully following footprints and broken branches. The dense canopy above filtered sunlight into shifting patterns, making landmarks deceptive. Even the most experienced trackers felt disoriented, measuring distance with uncertainty, while the forest thickness seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, concealing both danger and possibility. Ridges and hollows twisted unpredictably beneath the team's boots, and steep slopes were hidden beneath layers of leaf litter and tangled undergrowth. Fallen trees created natural barricades, forcing the searchers to divert their path repeatedly. Small streams cut across their route, some shallow and harmless, others swollen by recent rain, creating sudden obstacles that could easily sweep away boots or equipment. The uneven terrain slowed progress and required constant attention, leaving little room for error. Every footstep demanded caution, and every deviation risked losing the trail, while the forest's intricate natural design tested the tracker's endurance, patience, and decision-making with relentless consistency. The team approached their mission methodically, combining traditional tracking with modern technology. Compasses, GPS units, and detailed maps guided their progress, while radios maintained contact with surface coordinators. Each team member was trained to interpret subtle clues, footprints pressed into soft earth, displaced leaves, or bent ferns that suggested movement. Mist and wind distorted both sound and scent, but trackers relied on years of experience to differentiate human tracks from those of wildlife. Every observation required scrutiny, and each interpretation carried uncertainty, emphasizing that precision, vigilance, and patience were as crucial as physical skill in navigating the Smoky Mountains' deceptive environment. Small details became essential for navigation, though they were easily misread. Paw prints and scattered leaves frequently mimicked human footprints, misleading trackers down false paths. Disturbances in moss or cracked bark could indicate a hiker's passage, or the activity of a raccoon or deer. Leaf litter concealed impressions until carefully examined. The team had to continuously reassess their assumptions, balancing intuition against observation. In conditions of low visibility, even experienced trackers relied on repeated verification of environmental signs. The forest's constant, subtle motion created uncertainty, making it clear that this search was not only a test of skill, but of judgment and patience in the face of a living, shifting labyrinth. The weather added another layer of difficulty. Fog thickened unpredictably, sometimes reducing visibility to only a few meters. Intermittent drizzle slicked moss and rock, and gusting winds altered ambient sounds, masking signals from teammates. Streams and small waterfalls could swell without warning, turning previously passable crossings into hazards. These environmental changes demanded rapid adaptation, forcing trackers to slow their pace and recalibrate both strategy and perception. The forest, already disorienting, became actively hostile, testing decision-making under pressure. Every footfall required mindfulness, and every misjudgment carried amplified risk. The team learned quickly that the mountain's weather was as formidable as its terrain. Communication proved equally challenging. Dense tree cover and undulating terrain distorted radio signals, forcing reliance on hand signals and prearranged whistles. Line of sight was difficult to maintain across ridges and valleys. Even minor delays in check-ins created uncertainty, raising concern over whether a team member was merely delayed or had encountered a hazard. Coordination required constant vigilance, adaptability, and redundancy. Each tracker monitored the surroundings for signs of movement and listened intently for cues from others. The forest's natural interference tested the limits of human organization, demonstrating that meticulous planning could be undermined by the environment at any moment. Physical and psychological strain grew steadily. Heavy packs, uneven footing, and relentless attention fatigued both body and mind. Fog, low light, and dense canopy created a claustrophobic effect, heightening stress and anxiety. Subtle environmental sounds became alarming, and shadows occasionally tricked eyes into seeing movement that wasn't there. The forest tested not only skill but endurance, demanding both mental resilience and acute sensory awareness. Even seasoned trackers found themselves doubting interpretations of tracks or environmental cues. The combination of physical exertion and cognitive overload underscored the forest's ability to influence perception and decision-making in ways that could quickly alter the search's trajectory. The forest itself presented unpredictable obstacles. Fallen trunks, thick thickets, hidden streams, and steep ravines disrupted progress and required constant recalibration of routes. Terrain could appear navigable at first glance, but conceal pitfalls that slowed the team or forced backtracking. Each natural challenge amplified the difficulty of coordinating movement and interpreting subtle signs of human presence. Even with training and experience, the searchers were acutely aware that the Smoky Mountains environment could transform familiar paths into hazards without warning. The terrain demanded attention, caution, and flexibility, highlighting that the forest was not simply a backdrop but an active participant in the search. Warning signs emerged subtly, radio check-ins became inconsistent, and tracks began to appear fragmented or contradictory. Leaves and soil occasionally suggested movement that could not be accounted for. The team faced the unnerving possibility that the environment itself was masking clues, or that one or more members could have become separated. Each uncertainty added pressure as time passed without definitive confirmation of progress. The forest's density, fog, and uneven topography created conditions where even careful observation could fail, leaving trackers to navigate by instinct and careful deduction, aware that a single error might dramatically compromise the mission. Historically, the Great Smoky Mountains have been the site of numerous SAR complications and mysterious disappearances. Skilled searchers have been temporarily lost or delayed, confounded by fog, steep ravines, and deceptive trails. Past incidents highlighted the forest's unpredictability and reinforced the need for extreme caution and procedural discipline. Such context weighed heavily on the current operation, reminding the team that their environment had a history of confounding even those trained to master it. Knowledge of previous incidents heightened tension, as the same natural features, fog, canopy density, hidden ravines, posed identical risks to the current searchers. Reinforcements expanded the search grid, deploying additional trackers and surface teams to intersect potential paths. Despite these efforts, limited sightlines and the forest's complexity hindered coordination. New teams were deployed cautiously, as overlapping paths and miscommunication could create confusion and waste valuable time. The mountain's fog and shifting light patterns added to the difficulty, often rendering familiar terrain almost unrecognizable. Even with extra personnel, the forest demanded careful pacing, redundancy in tracking, and constant re-evaluation of assumptions to prevent further disorientation and potential danger. Sunlight filtered intermittently through thick foliage, creating constantly changing shadows that altered the perception of depth and distance. Trees, ravines, and dense underbrush appeared to shift as trackers moved, producing illusions that challenged spatial awareness. These optical distortions forced the team to slow their pace, double-check paths, and confirm observations repeatedly. Familiar landmarks were deceptive, and minor misjudgments could extend search time or redirect efforts entirely. The interplay of light, shadow, and fog created an environment in which even highly trained searchers could lose orientation, emphasizing that perception in the forest was as fragile as the tracks they followed. Though armed with training, maps, radios, and teamwork, the searchers remained vulnerable to the forest's relentless complexity. Dense canopy, thick underbrush, hidden ravines, and the constant manipulation of light and shadow limited human control. Even careful tracking could fail when natural forces obscured paths, displaced evidence, or altered perception. The fate of the SAR team remained unresolved, suspended within the Smoky Mountains' deceptive expanse. Every precaution was in place, yet the forest retained ultimate authority over those who entered it, reminding observers that human skill, while formidable, could still be humbled by nature's subtle but unyielding power. In the smoky, mist-shrouded woods of Tennessee, the mountains held their secrets tightly, letting neither lost hiker nor their rescuers escape the forest's silent judgment. The Mount Rainier Whiteout Operation. A hush settled over the staging area as rescuers double-checked maps, coordinates, and equipment, each glance heavy with the knowledge that Mount Rainier's winter slopes could turn fatal in moments. Base camp buzzed with a tense focus, radios crackling intermittently and boots crunching over icy platforms. Supplies were secured, layered clothing adjusted, and each climber paused to consider the route ahead. Even seasoned searchers felt an undercurrent of unease. The mountain, covered in snow and ice, seemed almost alive, stretching upward in silent dominance. Every decision mattered, every calculation carried weight, and the rescue team's awareness of the mountain's reputation sharpened their concentration as the storm approached. Harnesses were checked meticulously, ice axes tested, crampons fastened tightly to boots, and ropes looped through carabiners with precise care. Radios emitted brief static bursts, prompting repeated checks, while weather monitors projected shifting wind speeds and visibility estimates. Each piece of gear was a lifeline, yet none could guarantee safety in the mountain's unpredictable winter environment. The team's leaders went over contingency plans, confirming what to do if a member became separated or injured. Snow and ice concealed hidden dangers beneath even the most level-looking slopes. Every precaution taken emphasized that skill alone could not overcome Mount Rainier's winter volatility. Footsteps crunched over packed snow as the team moved in tight formation along their grid search path, following predetermined coordinates that intersected potential hiker locations. Snowdrifts shifted underfoot, concealing crevasses and unstable ice, requiring constant scanning of the ground ahead. Searchers called out coordinates, confirming spacing and proximity with hand signals where visibility failed. Even slight deviations could lead to dangerous terrain. Progress was deliberate and slow, each movement measured against potential hazards concealed beneath the fresh snow. The mountain's vastness created a sense of isolation despite the team's numbers, magnifying the difficulty of the mission and the consequences of a single misstep. Voices carried strangely across the slopes, muffled by gusting wind or distorted by drifting snow, creating uncertainty about distance and position. Shouts meant to coordinate movements often returned as distorted echoes, sometimes spurring sudden cautious freezes as searchers tried to differentiate reality from illusion. The storm acted as an unpredictable amplifier and suppressor of sound, hiding some noises while exaggerating others. Even experienced climbers relied on sight, sound, and intuition in tandem, yet none could fully anticipate the mountain's manipulation of perception. Misjudged distances and deceptive angles added constant tension, reminding every team member that navigation in the whiteout was a relentless mental challenge. Sudden changes in the snow's surface revealed hidden ice patches, fragile overhangs, and inconspicuous crevasses, forcing continuous assessment of every step. Searchers probed surfaces with poles and ice axes before committing their weight, aware that a hidden cavity could easily swallow a boot or topple a climber. Slopes that seemed shallow concealed steep drops. Ice bridges appeared stable until subtle cracks betrayed instability. Every movement demanded attention and careful planning, and even minor oversights risked serious injury. The mountain's hazards were not just theoretical, they were present in every step, shaping the team's progress and keeping fear and caution as constant companions throughout the ascent. Numb fingers and weighted boots slowed movement, while exhaustion gnawed at focus and decision-making. The cold infiltrated layers of clothing, numbing extremities and making delicate adjustments more difficult. Mental fatigue grew alongside physical strain, with each hour magnifying the challenge of assessing terrain, reading subtle signs of human or animal passage, and maintaining situational awareness. The relentless effort tested both endurance and resilience, revealing the human limits when confronted with unyielding natural conditions. Even for highly trained personnel, the combination of cold, fatigue, and whiteout conditions created a cognitive fog that made every judgment heavier, slower, and fraught with uncertainty. Occasional crackles from radios signaled interference, leaving teams dependent on visual gestures, whistle codes, and prearranged procedures. Even with meticulous planning, contact became intermittent, and searchers faced the unsettling prospect of being physically close, yet entirely unable to communicate. Signals were blocked, distorted, or absorbed by drifts and ridges, highlighting the inherent limitations of technology in extreme environments. Teams had to anticipate failures, building redundancy into their movements, while the mountain's silence and storm amplified the psychological weight of isolation. Every effort to maintain cohesion required vigilance, focus, and coordination under conditions that actively worked against them. Snowdrifts quickly erased footprints, leaving tracks indistinguishable from natural disturbances. Every passing minute threatened to obliterate evidence of their progress. Even minor markers planted in previous sweeps disappeared beneath shifting snow, forcing searchers to retrace steps, double-check assumptions, and constantly recalibrate their sense of direction. Each false lead added frustration, fatigue, and tension, while the environment seemed almost deliberate in its concealment of human activity. The team experienced a growing awareness that the mountain's white blanket had a power to erase certainty and render even well-trained trackers blind to their own path. The mountain's history added an ominous undertone to the operation. Mount Rainier has long been notorious for SAR complications, particularly in winter. Decades of climbers and rescuers have vanished or been delayed, misled by snow, ice, and whiteout conditions. Even past incidents informed the team's strategy, reminding them that the mountain's unpredictability had claimed skillful and experienced personnel before. Knowledge of these historical challenges intensified the tension on the slopes, as each step was measured not only against terrain but also against precedent, underscoring that the mountain was a force that could defy human planning entirely. Ropes were doubled, routes reconsidered, and GPS readings confirmed repeatedly as searchers adapted to the terrain. Despite these precautions, the landscape changed with every gust of wind and drift of snow. High ridges concealed potential crevasses, slopes that seemed navigable vanished under fresh accumulations. Every adjustment of position required deliberate verification, and decisions became a delicate balance between forward movement and safety. Even with redundancy built into their plans, the mountain maintained authority over progress, asserting control through unpredictable conditions that continuously challenged both skill and judgment. Wind-driven snow reshaped slopes, obscuring landmarks and blurring lines between path and precipice. Searchers relied increasingly on intuition, memory, and repeated observation, knowing that every misstep could separate a member from the group. The whiteout created a featureless expanse where the mind attempted to impose order on chaos. Visual cues disappeared, and auditory signals became unreliable, creating a landscape in which orientation could fail despite careful attention. The team's expertise was tested not only physically but also cognitively, as the mountain demanded a level of focus and adaptability that approached the edge of human capacity. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by wind gusts and muted coordination attempts, while fatigue and exposure compounded every step's risk. The storm's intensity made previous progress nearly meaningless, as each drift of snow concealed or erased effort, creating a sense of futility that weighed on morale. Visibility declined steadily, and each slope felt steeper, each ridge more perilous. The environment stripped away certainty, leaving only the cold, the wind, and the endless white expanse, forcing rescuers to confront their own vulnerability in a landscape that refused to be tamed. Finally, with daylight fading and all markers buried, no signals returned from several team members. Footprints and evidence of passage vanished beneath fresh drifts, and the last known locations of rescuers became points of uncertainty in a vast, featureless expanse. Attempts to regroup were hampered by snow, wind, and terrain that had transformed beneath them. Every precaution taken seemed insufficient, and the mountain's relentless conditions had swallowed progress. Even expert planning could not counter the combination of fatigue, environmental deception, and whiteout that claimed both visibility and certainty, leaving the outcome unresolved. At the edge of a slope where a final marker had once stood, rescuers vanished from sight, leaving only disrupted snow and scattered equipment as silent testimony to their passage. The mountain retained control, indifferent to human efforts, while the storm continued to sculpt, erase, and conceal. Every ridge, drift, and hidden crevasse bore witness to the mountain's authority over those who dared traverse it. Even with radios, GPS, ropes, and teamwork, the team became absorbed into the landscape, leaving a haunting absence that underscored the unforgiving power of Mount Rainier in winter. Mount Rainier's icy slopes held its missing rescuers in a frozen silence, leaving the storm to guard their fate unseen and unresolved. The Indonesian tsunami aftershock search. A tsunami swept across Indonesia's coastal villages with overwhelming force, swallowing homes, washing away streets, and transforming familiar terrain into an unrecognizable expanse of water, mud, and debris. Streets had turned into canals, entire markets had vanished beneath waves, and collapsed roofs jutted out of the murky water like jagged islands. Local authorities issued immediate alerts, while international relief agencies scrambled to send support, yet the scale of devastation made even an initial assessment nearly impossible. For the first responders entering the chaos, each step required vigilance, as the landscape had been altered so completely that familiar landmarks no longer offered guidance or safety. Boats, trucks, and helicopters were deployed under careful coordination, with rescuers prioritizing areas where survivors were most likely trapped. Accessing coastal hamlets proved difficult. Roads were ripped apart, bridges reduced to splintered remnants, and trees uprooted into impassable blockades. Helicopters hovered cautiously, lowering spotters to identify pockets of people stranded in debris-laden floodwaters. Logistics teams established temporary staging zones on higher ground, attempting to funnel personnel and supplies efficiently. Even with careful planning, every deployment carried uncertainty, as unpredictable water currents and submerged hazards threatened equipment, vehicles, and those navigating the disaster zone on foot or in small craft. Search parties moved methodically through flooded neighborhoods, wading through chest-deep water and slipping along unstable mud while scanning for survivors. Each home had been affected differently, some partially submerged, others entirely collapsed, making a systematic approach essential. Rescuers lifted debris cautiously, calling out repeatedly to detect responses from anyone trapped below. The sound of shifting water, cracking wood, and collapsing structures punctuated the efforts, reminding them that danger remained constant. Even as they focused on individuals, the broader threat of aftershocks loomed, with each tremor potentially toppling weakened walls, sending piles of mud cascading across pathways or sweeping rescuers into hidden channels of turbulent water. Every doorway, corridor, and alley presented a hidden risk. Floors softened by mud and debris gave way under even a cautious step, while ceilings, already compromised, threatened to collapse without warning. Rescuers leaned on makeshift poles to test surfaces, probing for voids that could conceal survivors or hazards. Dusty air mingled with waterborne silt, reducing visibility and making even the act of moving forward uncertain. Teams had to move slowly, pausing to communicate findings silently with hand gestures when voice could not carry. Each careful movement was a negotiation between urgency and survival, with the potential for disaster looming in every direction. Strong currents carried debris unpredictably, sweeping timber, vehicles, and fragments of buildings into new areas within moments. Foot searchers and boat operators alike had to constantly anticipate shifting hazards, as submerged gaps and weak mud banks could trap or overturn them in an instant. Even experienced personnel underestimated the speed and force of the water in certain channels, forcing continual adjustments to routes and tactics. Some rescuers found themselves retracing paths minutes after navigating them, as debris had moved or water had receded to reveal new dangers. Each step into the aftermath became a calculated risk, balancing the potential for discovery against the omnipresent threat of sudden injury. Exhaustion set in quickly, amplified by heat, humidity, and the relentless psychological strain of witnessing devastation. Many rescuers pushed beyond physical limits, fueled by adrenaline and the hope of finding survivors, yet the mental toll was constant. Faces showed weariness, hands trembled from exertion, and sweat mixed with silt as the day wore on. Witnessing entire families missing, entire streets reduced to rubble, weighed heavily on morale. Amid the chaos, rescuers relied on instinct and careful training, attempting to compartmentalize the horror around them while focusing on the tasks at hand, understanding that one lapse could endanger both themselves and those they sought to help. Individuals struggled to maintain sight and awareness of one another as signals faded and paths became uncertain. The chaotic, shifting landscape made even familiar procedures unreliable, forcing rescuers to rely on intuition, careful observation, and memory to navigate areas that had changed dramatically in minutes. Calls for help echoed unevenly, sometimes distorted by distance or flowing water, while debris and mud created natural barriers that separated members physically and mentally. Each step required constant assessment, and the possibility of separation heightened tension. Even the most seasoned rescuers felt unease as the landscape's unpredictability reminded them that danger lurked not only from the elements, but also from the environment itself. Scattered personal belongings and faint signs of human activity offered clues, but shifting mud and receding water erased evidence almost as quickly as it appeared. A partially submerged shoe, a child's toy, or a floating bundle of clothing could signal a survivor or indicate a prior path. Yet these traces vanished under constant water movement. Rescuers documented everything, photographing and marking sites, yet the ephemeral nature of these signs made the work feel like chasing shadows. Uncertainty pervaded every decision. Did the trace lead to someone still alive, or had it been left behind hours or minutes earlier, already swept away by the shifting floodwaters? Indonesia's long history of earthquakes and tsunamis reminded every responder that aftershocks could arrive without warning, destabilizing already fragile structures and reshaping terrain in seconds. Every tremor caused debris to shift, trees to sway precariously, and water to surge in unpredictable ways, amplifying the hazards for anyone in the area. Even areas previously deemed safe suddenly became treacherous. Rescuers constantly recalculated risk, monitoring tremors while proceeding with caution, aware that the same forces that had created the disaster could strike again, undermining their careful planning and putting both teams and survivors at immediate risk. Improvisation became essential. Ropes were stretched across flooded zones, makeshift rafts carried personnel over deep channels, and hand signals coordinated movement when radios failed or voices were lost in the roar of water. Creativity extended to stabilizing partially collapsed buildings, using debris to reinforce weakened floors, and fashioning temporary walkways over treacherous mud. Each improvised measure demonstrated ingenuity born from necessity, but every solution carried inherent risk. The work was physically and mentally demanding, and the margin for error remained thin, reminding rescuers that ingenuity alone could not fully shield them from the disaster's unpredictability. Water levels rose and fell unpredictably, with sudden surges revealing submerged hazards and hidden voids, while aftershocks rattled weakened structures, sending mud and debris sliding without warning. Every fluctuation altered the terrain, forcing rescuers to continually reassess their paths and techniques. Even familiar locations became treacherous, as shifting conditions could trap searchers who had just navigated them moments earlier. The instability of the environment imposed constant vigilance, with each change requiring quick adaptation to maintain safety while continuing to search. Survival depended as much on observation and timing as on skill and stamina. Some rescuers failed to report in as scheduled, equipment was discovered abandoned, and debris obscured any sign of human presence, creating an unsettling sense that even the rescuers themselves could vanish. Anxiety increased as the day wore on and positions remained uncertain, leaving those in contact with missing personnel to fear the worst. The same conditions that threatened survivors now imperiled those sent to find them. Observers noted the eerie silence in areas where movement should have been visible, and the unpredictability of the environment left a haunting impression that the disaster could swallow even the most prepared and vigilant. The final traces of the operation offered no answers. The missing rescuers' last positions remained hidden beneath mud, water, and debris, leaving only scattered tools, disrupted waterways, and faint marks of human effort to hint at where they had gone. Records of initial movements provided only partial insight, and every clue had been altered or erased by nature's relentless force. Relief agencies documented the evidence meticulously, yet the human presence seemed almost spectral, leaving only questions of what had happened to those dedicated to saving others and why they had disappeared into the very disaster they sought to confront. The Indonesian coastline held its lost rescuers in a chaotic stillness, leaving only the rising tides to witness their fate. The Sierra Nevada avalanche sweep. A low rumble beneath the fresh snow signalled the fragile stability of the Sierra Nevada slopes, where recent storms had left the landscape deceptively calm and the air dense with icy tension. Snow layers varied in depth and density, creating hidden pockets of weakness, and even small vibrations could set entire fields of snow into motion. Local guides and avalanche specialists had warned of the danger zones, yet the urgency to locate those buried by a prior slide drove the rescuers forward. Every step across the sparkling white surface required careful assessment, as the mountain itself seemed alive and wary of intrusion. Rescuers checked transceivers, strapped on probes, and moved carefully into position, each aware that a single misstep could trigger slides or bury evidence of movement before it could be documented. Equipment was meticulously inspected, from avalanche beacons to shovels and rope harnesses, ensuring functionality under extreme cold. Teams coordinated over radio channels, establishing checkpoints along the slope to track movement. The tension in the air was palpable, as even minor miscalculations could compromise the entire operation. Every member knew the stakes. Snow and gravity were indifferent to human urgency, and the harsh alpine environment demanded respect and constant vigilance. Their initial sweep began cautiously, probing drifts and scanning for displaced snow, while the wind carved new patterns across the slope, turning familiar paths into shifting illusions. Snow crystals glistened deceptively, masking soft layers beneath, while the faint scent of disturbed pine and cold stone lingered in the air. The rescuers' eyes scanned for these subtle depressions or ridges that might indicate a body or equipment, yet every movement of snow threatened to erase these markers. The interplay of light and shadow on the powder created illusions that challenged perception, and each decision carried weight, forcing judgment under constant uncertainty. Hidden crevices and cornices revealed themselves only in fleeting shadows, forcing careful navigation across snow-laden gullies where a fall could be fatal. Beneath the soft powder, gaps in the earth and ice could swallow a person whole, and windborne snow often concealed these voids. Team leaders paused repeatedly, testing each step with poles, while others probed the edges of overhanging cornices to ensure they could bear weight. The mountain's surface was deceptive, appearing uniform but hiding sudden drops, jagged ice, and compressed snow layers that could collapse without warning. Every movement was deliberate, balancing the imperative to find survivors with the instinct for self-preservation. Calls were whispered, gestures exchanged, and steps measured. Each rescuer had to maintain vigilance while remaining in contact, balancing urgency against the unpredictability of the avalanche terrain. Voices carried only so far across the wind-whipped slopes, and miscommunication could lead to separation. Each member relied on sightlines, practice signals, and careful pacing to move in unison while probing deep snowfields. Mental focus was as essential as physical effort, because a single lapse in attention could result in misjudging snow stability or overlooking a faint clue indicating a buried individual. The team moved with cautious precision, aware that time itself was against them. An abandoned probe and a partially buried pack hinted at a sudden event, leaving the team uncertain whether a colleague had moved ahead, been caught by shifting snow, or retreated under duress. The items were placed in patterns suggesting hurried motion, yet the surrounding snow revealed no definitive tracks. Such anomalies amplified unease, forcing leaders to reconsider routes and double back to ensure all members were accounted for. Every layer of snow seemed to conceal secrets, and the environment was quick to erase traces of human activity. The situation underscored the mountain's dominance, reminding the team that even the best-trained rescuers were vulnerable to its unpredictability. Blizzard-like gusts swept across the ridges, obscuring visibility and transforming the slope into a maze of shadows and drifting powder that tested both skill and nerve. Snow whipped into blinding sheets, freezing exposed skin and covering tracks in seconds, creating a sense of isolation despite the team's proximity. Navigation became treacherous, and simple markers disappeared almost as soon as they were established. The rescuers relied on compasses, GPS devices, and intuition, yet the storm undermined confidence, making the slope feel like a shifting, unknowable landscape. The wind howled like an echo of the avalanche that had first swept the area, a constant reminder of nature's indifference. Footprints half buried by fresh snow suggested movement that may have been recent, yet each mark was distorted or erased within minutes, leaving rescuers guessing at who had passed through and when. Even careful documentation failed to capture these transient traces before they were altered by wind or drifting snow. The ambiguity left the team questioning their assumptions, unsure whether the signs indicated progress, retreat, or the disappearance of someone entirely. Every observation had to be weighed against the possibility of deception by the environment itself, as the snow's constant motion rendered certainty fleeting. Snow cracks and minor slides echoed across the mountainside, constantly altering the terrain and erasing the subtle signs of human passage that might have guided the search. Each tremor of snow created new hazards, uncovering voids, shifting equipment, and forcing sudden course corrections. Even well-established routes could vanish or become deadly, requiring rescuers to constantly reassess both the terrain and the signals that led them forward. The mountain's surface was dynamic, never static, and the pattern of minor slides hinted at the latent danger lurking above, a reminder that another collapse could strike without warning. Improvised anchors and rope bridges were deployed to traverse weakened sections, demonstrating ingenuity born of necessity while highlighting the peril inherent in every crossing. Wooden probes, metal stakes, and frayed ropes became lifelines, allowing access across chasms and unstable slopes. Each improvised solution was tested cautiously, the tension in the ropes echoing through the snow, and each crossing became an exercise in patience, strength, and careful calculation. The team's ability to adapt was critical, yet the inherent risk of improvisation reminded everyone that survival depended not only on skill, but also on fortune. Whiteout conditions disoriented even the most experienced rescuers, and the altitude made every step heavier, each breath a reminder of the environment's relentless pressure. Snow reflected light in blinding patterns, masking contours and hiding treacherous dips, while cold air sapped energy and slowed judgment. Maps and GPS devices were consulted repeatedly, yet every check reinforced uncertainty, as landmarks vanished beneath the wind-blown drifts. Mental strain compounded physical exhaustion, and the rescuers understood that disorientation in this environment could be as lethal as a collapse or slide. Some members failed to report in at designated intervals, while their gear was discovered scattered or partially buried, intensifying the sense that the slope itself might have claimed them. Radio transmissions grew sparse, and improvised markers were partially obliterated by drifting snow. The remaining team faced a grim reality. The avalanche's aftermath had not only endangered those buried, but may have already taken those searching for them. Each searcher became acutely aware of vulnerability, as the mountain's indifference contrasted sharply with human determination. The signs pointed to disappearance, leaving questions unanswered and a lingering fear that more could be lost. The aftermath left only faint disturbances in the snow, broken probes and scattered footprints, preserving a silent record of the missing rescuers' passage but no explanation of their final fate. The wind smoothed the surface almost immediately, erasing patterns and consolidating evidence into mere impressions, barely detectable by trained eyes. Photographs, GPS logs, and meticulous notes offered partial insight, yet the mountain's dynamic forces ensured that certainty was unattainable. Observers could only piece together fragments of movement, each telling a story of courage, vulnerability, and the relentless environment that had swallowed so much, leaving both human effort and tragedy frozen in the snow. The Sierra Nevada slope held its lost rescuers beneath layers of snow and stillness, leaving only the wind to record their absence. The Scottish Highlands moorland vanishing. Stories of vanished travellers had long circulated across the Scottish Highlands, tales of people who entered the moorland and never returned, leaving only questions and faint traces behind. When word came of a missing party in one of the remote stretches, a specialised search team was dispatched, fully aware of the landscape's deceptive reputation. Maps were studied, protocols reviewed, and equipment meticulously inspected, each member bracing for the uncertainty ahead. Even the most experienced rescuers understood that caution was critical. The moorland could conceal tracks, distort perception, and turn a routine search into an unfolding mystery. Assignments were distributed carefully, with each rescuer responsible for a defined sector, ensuring that the line of coverage remained consistent while maintaining the ability to regroup if signals were lost or obstacles arose. Sector boundaries were marked on maps and reinforced with radio check-ins, while members memorized potential hazards including peat bogs, concealed watercourses, and hidden gullies. This organizational strategy emphasized redundancy and vigilance, recognizing that even minor lapses could prove dangerous in terrain that had claimed lives before. Every team member knew the balance between thoroughness and the necessity of maintaining safe contact with colleagues. Initial movements were deliberate and measured, with every probe and step calculated to detect any disturbance in the terrain, from subtle depressions to flattened vegetation that might suggest the missing individuals had passed that way. Lines of rescuers moved cautiously, scanning heather and uneven soil while testing footing with poles. Each detail was logged, from impressions in the peat to traces of mud or footprints that appeared partially erased by time or wind. Even small anomalies were treated seriously. The moorland's history suggested that minor signs could be the only evidence of human presence before someone disappeared entirely. Tools and ropes were employed to examine unstable patches, and the team documented anomalies meticulously, aware that even the smallest clue could offer insight into a path that vanished without explanation. Probes tested the depth of bogs, and ropes provided additional safety when crossing slippery or uncertain terrain. Equipment was checked repeatedly, and notes were taken at each marker point. The rescuers knew that the moorland could conceal depressions that swallowed boots and supplies alike, and that careful, repeated observation was essential to both their own safety and the hope of recovering the missing. Coordination relied heavily on hand signals and brief, precise verbal exchanges, allowing the searchers to remain alert while preventing disorientation or separation in areas where visibility and reference points were inconsistent. Even slight gestures were used to indicate danger or points of interest, as shouting could be lost in distance or misinterpreted across ridges and depressions. Members moved in patterns designed to maximize coverage, alternating forward and lateral sweeps while remaining attentive to any faint signal of prior movement or unusual disturbance in the terrain. Faint remnants appeared sporadically, a torn fragment of clothing snagged on a low bush, slight depressions in peat, and scattered footprints that seemed almost erased by time or terrain, challenging the team to interpret their significance. Each discovery prompted careful documentation, photographs, and measured probing, yet no combination of clues provided clear direction. The ambiguous nature of the signs fueled unease, leaving rescuers questioning whether they represented recent passage, older activity, or simply natural disturbances misread as evidence of human presence. Unexpected weather shifts brought colder gusts and sudden damp patches across the moorland, forcing the rescuers to adjust their pace and anticipate hazards, while the mystery of the missing party lingered with every step. The region's unpredictable climate meant that soft patches could deepen in minutes, visibility could shift dramatically, and familiar landmarks could vanish behind a haze of low clouds. Each change demanded vigilance and reinforced the team's awareness that a single misjudgment might result in another disappearance, perpetuating the moorland's reputation for swallowing those who ventured too far. A signal from one radio intermittently cut through the static, hinting at life or prior presence, though no pattern could be discerned and no voice came through clearly enough to provide direction. The faint pulse of electricity offered reassurance while also amplifying frustration. A clue without clarity, a signal without identity. Rescuers recalibrated equipment, attempted to triangulate the origin, and maintained position while observing for any disturbances that might correspond to the transmission. Yet the signal was fleeting, vanishing as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the uncertainty of whether it came from the missing party or from a previous searcher's device left behind. Isolation began to affect perception. Distances seemed greater, lines of sight distorted, and familiar pathways twisted, leaving even seasoned rescuers questioning the reliability of their own senses. Subtle depressions appeared, then disappeared, and shadows of ridges shifted with a light that could not be trusted. Human attention stretched thin across the monotonous moor, where minor irregularities felt amplified, and every anomaly sparked a decision: pursue it or continue sweeping methodically. This tension created an invisible pressure, as though the moorland itself were testing the limits of attention, endurance, and collective coordination. Improvised markers were placed to track movements and establish a safe route through treacherous patches, yet the moorland resisted these attempts, concealing depressions, waterlogged areas, and subtle pitfalls that challenged every precaution. Ropes were extended, poles set to probe the ground, and temporary flags indicated routes back to higher or more stable terrain. Despite these measures, the rescuers knew that unseen hazards could exist beneath heather or peat, capable of destabilizing both people and equipment. Every advance was deliberate, and the team moved with the knowledge that even careful planning might not prevent another disappearance. Intervals of silence grew longer as members became separated by unseen rises and dips, and anxiety built with each missed check-in, while the searchers relied on intuition, experience, and careful method to navigate the increasingly enigmatic terrain. Radio calls were attempted, lines retraced, and visual signals scanned, but confirmation of colleague positions remained elusive. Tension thickened in the mind as well as the field, and the ambiguity of the moorland seemed to magnify each sound, shadow, and movement, leaving the team questioning the boundary between human error and the landscape's mysterious influence. Disappearance escalated into confusion when some rescuers failed to remain in sight of their colleagues, leaving behind partially buried equipment or footprints that led to nothing, heightening the sense that the moor itself had claimed them. Attempts to regroup were complicated by the same features that had hidden the initial missing party: uneven ground, bogs, and deceptive depressions. Every line swept revealed fragments that suggested passage but offered no answers. The environment seemed almost purposeful in obscuring its secrets, presenting a series of clues that resolved into nothing but uncertainty, challenging the perception of control even for trained searchers. After hours that stretched into a day, only subtle disturbances in heather, scattered tools, and faint impressions in peat bore witness to the search efforts, leaving no answers, only fragments that whispered of human passage swallowed entirely by the vast, unyielding moorland. Each return to the base offered reports of absence rather than presence, notes of observation rather than discovery. The sense of something unseen lingered in the minds of those who had ventured out, reinforcing the Highlands' reputation as a place where even the methodical efforts of professionals could be undone by its vast, inscrutable character. The Scottish Highlands moorland kept its missing rescuers hidden in silence, preserving the mystery of their disappearance for those who would follow. The Grand Canyon Rim-to-River Mission. The vast expanse of the Grand Canyon stretched below the rim, a labyrinth of cliffs, ledges, and hidden ravines that made every step a calculated risk for the search team called to locate a missing party. Even with topographic maps, GPS markers, and prior aerial reconnaissance, the rescuers knew that the canyon could conceal hazards and erase signs of human presence in minutes. Each rope, each anchor point, and every movement was considered with precision. The anticipation was almost tangible as the team prepared to descend, fully aware that the canyon's depth and scale could transform a methodical search into a battle against disorientation and risk. Before beginning the descent, each member received a clearly defined sector, with responsibilities carefully coordinated to balance coverage, safety, and the need to maintain contact despite the canyon's vertical challenges. Leaders reviewed emergency procedures while assigning backup partners to each rescuer, ensuring redundancy in case of separation or accident. Each member memorized points of reference on both rim and riverbanks, noting faint trails or natural formations that could guide movement. The combination of planning, human memory and technology provided a structured approach, yet the team understood that the canyon was unpredictable, capable of concealing clues or swallowing rescuers entirely without warning. As the rescuers lowered themselves along narrow ledges and rocky faces, their eyes scanned for subtle disturbances in the stone or debris that might mark the passage of those they sought. Pebbles were slightly displaced, scratches along ledges, and traces of rope suggested prior passage but yielded no clear direction. The team proceeded slowly, testing footholds and brushing away loose sediment to expose any hidden marks. Each member's awareness extended to micro-changes in terrain, as even the faintest anomaly could provide insight into the missing party's route. The canyon scale forced constant recalibration of judgment, combining experience with intuition as they advanced downward toward the Colorado River. Ropes were anchored with precision, equipment double-checked, and every movement measured to prevent slips or missteps that could transform the mission into a perilous struggle for survival. Carabiners were clipped, knots examined, and backup lines secured to natural features like boulders or ledges. The rescuers knew that misjudging the integrity of a single anchor could result in injury or worse. Heavy packs contained supplies, first aid kits, and emergency communication devices, all distributed to ensure redundancy. Even with careful procedures, each step carried tension, as the canyon's steep walls and unstable rocks could transform minor errors into catastrophic consequences in seconds. Radio signals crackled intermittently, forcing the team to combine visual confirmations with the cautious gestures, a delicate choreography designed to prevent disorientation across the steep, fractured terrain. Communication delays were common as signals bounced off cliff faces, and faint transmissions required repeated checks. Visual cues, hands raised, reflective markers or subtle movement became critical to maintain coordination. The team constantly assessed the reliability of both devices and sightlines, aware that losing contact could have dire consequences. Every decision balanced progress with safety, as each member understood the risk of becoming isolated in one of the canyon's more treacherous sections. Occasional fragments of rope or impressions in the sediment hinted at prior movement, but their meaning remained ambiguous, and each discovery demanded careful interpretation rather than assumption. A short length of cord snagged on a ledge could indicate a rope left by the missing group, or from a previous exploration. Footprints partially filled with dust might reflect recent passage or weeks-old erosion. Each clue required meticulous recording, cross-referencing with maps and previous observations. The ambiguity weighed heavily as the team attempted to distinguish meaningful signs from natural disturbances while navigating a canyon that could both reveal and obscure evidence at the same glance. Sudden rock slides and unstable overhangs forced the rescuers to pause repeatedly, reminding them that the canyon's geology could shift without warning and conceal critical evidence. Pebbles tumbled down unseen paths, echoing against cliff walls in unpredictable patterns. Ledges that appeared solid sometimes yielded under weight, requiring re-evaluation of chosen routes. The team moved cautiously, reassessing each anchor, foothold and handhold, aware that even minor misjudgments could separate a rescuer from the line of safety. The canyon's geological complexity amplified both physical and mental strain, with every movement a reminder that it could conceal more than just the missing party. It could claim the searchers themselves. Isolation intensified the tension as distant team members became almost silhouettes against the canyon walls, leaving each rescuer reliant on intuition and experience to navigate the vertical maze. Sound traveled oddly in the canyon, exaggerating distance or masking calls for assistance. Visual markers shifted with perspective, and familiar landmarks appeared disorienting when viewed from different angles. Even brief moments of misjudged perception could create gaps in coverage or cause overlap in search paths. Each rescuer carried the weight of both responsibility and uncertainty, moving carefully while recognizing that the canyon's vastness could swallow both evidence and humans alike without leaving a trace. A faint whistle from a radio or the glint of a reflective marker briefly offered hope, but the signals were inconsistent, providing guidance without certainty and amplifying the sense of mystery. Attempts to triangulate signals were complicated by the canyon's depth and echoes, and no consistent source could be identified. Every signal raised questions. Had the missing party moved recently, or was it a leftover device? Rescuers paused, scanning cliffs and ledges while evaluating potential hazards, knowing that even following a perceived clue could lead to dangerous terrain. Each signal became both a tantalizing promise and a reminder of the canyon's deceptive nature. Paths were marked with temporary anchors and discrete tags to track movements and maintain safe routes, though even these precautions could not guarantee the safety of those venturing further into the canyon's depths. Flags and knots indicated progress, yet rescuers understood that the slightest disturbance, wind, falling rock, or shifting soil, could erase these markers. Every descent was recorded in field logs, but the canyon's sheer scale limited the usefulness of maps alone. Maintaining situational awareness required constant adjustment and cross-checking with fellow rescuers, creating a dynamic balance between forward momentum and careful observation. Disturbed stones, scattered debris, and subtle scuff marks suggested human presence but yielded no answers, leaving the team to weigh each fragment of evidence while confronting the canyon's deceptive scale. The items might be remnants of the missing group, or signs left by prior hikers and explorers. Each discovery prompted documentation, photographs, and cautious evaluation. The ambiguity left the rescuers in a state of perpetual uncertainty, confronting an environment where progress could not be measured solely by distance or visible clues, but also by the faintest signs of human passage in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. As daylight faded, perceptions warped. Distances appeared exaggerated, shadows obscured paths, and the once familiar landscape became a disorienting labyrinth, challenging every calculation and every assumption. Colours shifted with the waning sun, textures blended, and spatial orientation became increasingly difficult. The vertical drop seemed more extreme, the ledges narrower, and the paths less certain. Even seasoned rescuers felt the psychological weight of the canyon, realising that fatigue and uncertainty could amplify errors. Decisions were slowed by careful cross-referencing and double-checking, but no procedure could remove the ever-present risk that the terrain itself might intervene. The search gradually shifted from forward exploration to cautious observation, with rescuers noting partial evidence of passage and the frustrating absence of clarity, aware that the canyon had withheld its secrets once again. Reports were filed back at the rim base, noting depressions, rope fragments, and subtle disturbances without providing definitive answers. Each log entry reinforced the sense of incompleteness, a reminder that even careful, systematic effort could not fully conquer the canyon's scale or mystery. The team remained vigilant, knowing that the canyon had proven unpredictable, capable of concealing those who enter it, whether lost or searching for the lost. The Grand Canyon swallowed the rescuers' progress, leaving only questions carved as deeply as the canyon itself. The Japanese Mount Fuji Recovery Patrol. Reports had reached local authorities of climbers missing somewhere on the upper slopes of Mount Fuji, prompting the recovery patrol to mobilize quickly into the volcanic terrain, where time and conditions could determine survival. The mountain's slopes were steep and littered with scree, volcanic debris that shifted underfoot with every step. The air was thin, and visibility fluctuated as clouds rolled in from the Pacific, bringing sudden cold gusts that swept across the ridges. Despite the urgency, the patrol moved deliberately, balancing speed with caution, aware that a single misstep could endanger the rescuers as much as the missing climbers themselves. The team prepared meticulously, inspecting oxygen tanks, reinforced ropes, crampons, and harnesses, ensuring each piece of equipment could withstand the mountain's loose scree and sudden gusts while protecting them on the steep ascent. Every anchor, carabiner, and knot was double-checked. Team members confirmed that radios functioned at high altitude, and spare gear was packed in case of unexpected complications. Psychological readiness was just as important, with members briefing one another on potential hazards, hand signals, and emergency procedures. Even small oversights could be fatal on the slopes, and the patrol moved with a sense of deliberate, methodical focus. Stepping onto the volcanic scree, the rescuers found every movement required careful judgment, as rocks shifted unpredictably beneath boots, and each slope demanded attention to subtle variations in the terrain. Loose gravel crunched underfoot, threatening balance, while exposed ridges required constant scanning for sudden drop-offs. Each step had to be calculated, and the patrol maintained short distances to avoid dislodging rocks onto one another. Even experienced climbers felt the strain, aware that Mount Fuji's slopes could betray the most practiced footwork. Eyes alternated between the path ahead and the distant ridges, searching for traces of the missing party while negotiating the unstable terrain. Anchors were strategically set into the volcanic rock, knots and carabiners double-checked, creating a network of safety lines designed to secure progress even when the mountain seemed intent on testing every precaution. The ropes threaded carefully across exposed sections, sometimes clinging to jutting boulders, sometimes anchored in softer volcanic scree that required multiple reinforcements. Each anchor point became both a lifeline and a measure of progress, providing psychological reassurance against the mountain's inherent unpredictability. Even as the team advanced, they treated every foothold as provisional, testing stability and adjusting safety lines to reflect shifting conditions. Radio signals fluctuated as they climbed, bouncing across ridges and cliffs, forcing the patrol to combine gestures, hand signals, and visual markers to maintain communication when equipment alone could not. Every sudden crackle of static raised tension, and silence became almost ominous, suggesting distance, obstruction, or even interference from the terrain. The rescuers constantly recalibrated positions, scanning slopes and ridges to confirm each other's location. Temporary signals sometimes offered only fragments of information, leaving interpretation to judgment calls that could influence both safety and the likelihood of locating the missing climbers. Faint footprints and the occasional disturbed rock offered the first signs of the missing patrol, but each clue was partial and uncertain, requiring the team to interpret evidence with both caution and urgency. A boot print partially covered by windblown scree hinted at movement downhill, while a torn strap snagged on jagged rock suggested struggle or progress. Small piles of displaced gravel might indicate a campsite or a rest point, yet each observation was inconclusive, leaving the rescuers balancing hope against the very real possibility that nothing solid could be found in time. Jagged lava formations and hardened volcanic ridges punctuated the scree, creating pockets where snow and debris could accumulate unpredictably. The patrol navigated around these natural traps cautiously, noting that small depressions might conceal fractures or unstable overhangs capable of collapsing under weight. Streams of meltwater ran in narrow channels, carving miniature gullies that threatened to destabilize footing. Even minor shifts in terrain produced sounds that echoed unnervingly across the slopes, masking subtle movements from the missing climbers. The rescuers recorded each anomaly carefully, aware that these volcanic features could both conceal vital clues and conceal hidden dangers waiting silently beneath the surface. Sudden clouds and shifting winds swept up the slopes, reducing visibility and adding a sense of immediacy, as rescuers now navigated both the treacherous terrain and an increasingly volatile atmosphere. Cold gusts carried tiny stones across exposed ridges, and the scree beneath boots became more treacherous as moisture condensed on surfaces. Shadows shifted unpredictably as clouds moved, obscuring landmarks and creating disorienting contrasts of light and dark. The patrol pressed on, knowing that every minute counted, aware that weather patterns on Mount Fuji could change in an instant and transform a carefully planned route into a maze of hazards. Fatigue and altitude weighed heavily on each rescuer, amplifying the mental strain of constant vigilance, while every step demanded balance, focus, and a growing awareness of the mountain's unpredictability. Hearts raced from exertion, and lungs burned in the thin air as each individual calculated the margin for error on every slope. Even experienced climbers noted that decision-making slowed under these conditions, with small mistakes carrying consequences amplified by the steep, unstable terrain. Physical endurance was matched by mental endurance, as the team maintained situational awareness while interpreting subtle signs that could lead them to the missing patrol. Every fork in the scree presented critical choices, whether to descend a steep incline or press upward, decisions that could mean the difference between reaching the missing party or encountering unseen hazards. Each split required rapid assessment of slope stability, wind direction, and visibility. Team members consulted markers left along the ascent, referencing prior radio checks and visual cues. The balance between caution and urgency became almost tangible, as hesitation could waste precious minutes and recklessness could invite injury or worse. Scattered rope fragments, a torn strap, and small piles of displaced gravel hinted at prior movement, yet none provided certainty, leaving the patrol suspended between interpretation and imagination. The clues were tantalizing but incomplete, forcing every team member to weigh the implications carefully. Was this a sign of progress, a marker of survival, or simply a natural disturbance? Each discovery intensified the suspense, blending hope with anxiety, as rescuers pushed forward under the weight of ambiguity. Uniform volcanic slopes and drifting clouds disoriented the rescuers, making familiar markers appear alien and exaggerating distances between members, challenging both navigation and coordination. Perception shifted as shadows lengthened and rocks blended with the grey scree, creating illusions of depth and slope. Landmarks seemed to move or vanish entirely, forcing repeated confirmations and recalculations. Even the most experienced climbers questioned angles and distances, aware that one misjudgment could lead to lost footing or separation from the group. As the day progressed, the patrol consolidated positions and documented each partial finding, slowly retreating from exposed sections while planning to return with a clearer strategy and safer footing. Notes were made about rope placements, equipment left behind, and any signs suggesting the missing party's direction. Decisions were pragmatic. Preservation of life took precedence over relentless pursuit. The retreat was methodical, not a surrender, and the team maintained hope that a more comprehensive search could follow under safer conditions. Even after withdrawal, questions lingered. The faint traces left behind, the absence of definitive evidence, and the unknowable expanses of volcanic scree that might conceal secrets indefinitely. Each rescuer carried a lingering unease about what the mountain had withheld and what remained hidden, knowing that partial clues offered only fragments of truth. Mount Fuji's slopes held a quiet authority, indifferent to human urgency, and the patrol left with both frustration and a sense of awe at the mountain's enduring mystery. Mount Fuji concealed its secrets so completely that even the most prepared recovery patrol could vanish without a trace. The Alaskan bushplane search that stalled. Thick forests stretched endlessly beneath a grey sky, the kind of wilderness where a single misstep could vanish without a trace, hinting at the peril that had already claimed a search team in Alaska. Snow-laden pines bowed under their icy weight while frozen rivers threaded silently through the valleys below, seeming both protective and impenetrable. The bushplane was last seen departing from a small airstrip near the interior, a tool meant to traverse distances quickly, yet one that now symbolized both hope and vulnerability. Those assigned to follow its trail were immediately confronted with a vast, indifferent landscape. Coordinators checked flight paths against frozen rivers and ice-laden ridges, plotting every angle as the bushplane was prepped for a mission that would prove far more treacherous than any training could predict. Each member reviewed maps layered with topographical detail, noting areas where tree cover was thick enough to obscure the faintest signs of passage. Supply drops, emergency caches, and survival kits were meticulously organized, and radios calibrated, yet every check was underscored by the nagging awareness that extreme conditions could render equipment useless within minutes. Every decision weighed the balance between speed and caution. Snow-dusted pines and jagged outcrops cut across the landscape, forming obstacles that challenged both aerial observation and foot patrols, turning each moment of forward progress into a careful calculation. Even from the air, patches of frozen rivers appeared like cracks in a giant mirror, deceptive and treacherous. Ground searchers navigated dense thickets where footsteps could vanish as easily as they were made, and frozen gullies threatened to swallow a miscalculated step. The environment was relentless, offering only partial visibility and countless opportunities for minor errors to escalate into danger. Sudden gusts whipped across the valleys, scattering powdery snow and creating whiteout patches that swallowed landmarks, leaving pilots and ground teams disoriented and forcing them to trust only their instincts. From above, familiar ridgelines disappeared into sheets of shifting grey, making visual navigation nearly impossible. On the ground, the snow blurred the edges of ravines and concealed fragile ice bridges that could collapse under the weight of even a single rescuer. The team's awareness was stretched thin, each sense heightened as they pressed forward in a landscape that alternately revealed and obscured itself. The first hints of the missing plane appeared in subtle disturbances, a bent branch, faint impressions in snow, a glint of metal hidden among icy debris, each clue raising as many questions as it answered. A fragment of fabric, partially buried beneath powder, suggested a hurried exit or impact. Nearby, the snow was compressed in a pattern inconsistent with wildlife, hinting at human passage. Every discovery demanded careful recording, photographs and notation, yet no combination of these fragments yielded a clear direction. The terrain had a way of scattering signs, leaving rescuers perpetually uncertain. Rescue personnel alternated between navigating the rugged terrain on foot and coordinating via intermittent radio transmissions, aware that even a single miscommunication could separate them from each other. Teams moved slowly, checking each ridge and hollow, calling out coordinates while cross-referencing their aerial survey. Each radio burst carried static, sometimes cutting off entirely, and the uneven topography meant that even short distances could isolate a searcher in minutes. Trust and coordination were crucial, yet they were constantly tested by an environment that seemed intent on challenging every assumption. Snowdrifts accumulated faster than teams could measure, forming natural barricades along the trails that had been scouted hours earlier. Creeks that had been frozen moments ago suddenly revealed thin patches of ice, collapsing under weight and forcing rescuers to detour into dense forest. Wildlife tracks, moose, wolves and foxes, conflicted with human impressions, adding layers of confusion to navigation. Cold-induced equipment failures compounded the hazard. GPS devices malfunctioned, radios lost clarity, and sleds carrying supplies got stuck in deep powder. Each obstacle reminded the searchers that even a small misstep in Alaska could become catastrophic in minutes. Exhaustion etched itself into faces, and silence pressed around the searchers as if the Alaskan wilderness itself was observing, heightening anxiety with every step and flight circle. The relentless cold sapped energy faster than anticipated, and sleep-deprived minds strained to interpret ambiguous signs. Even small miscalculations became magnified, the rustle of snow or distant cracking ice eliciting immediate tension. Teams spoke in clipped phrases, their voices cautious against the omnipresent hush, aware that distraction or overconfidence could transform a minor error into catastrophe. Engines groaned against thick frost and ice-coated wings, while rescuers grappled with frozen controls, frozen instruments, and the constant risk of hypothermia, each mechanical struggle a reminder of the environment's merciless demands. Pre-flight checks became laborious rituals, each failure a potential delay or worse. Maintenance crews risked frozen extremities while shoving ice from propellers and fuel lines, knowing that a single misstep could strand an aircraft far from base. Even seasoned pilots admitted that these mechanical struggles were as formidable as the terrain itself. Small anomalies drew intense scrutiny. A patch of disturbed snow here, a broken sapling there, each potentially marking the path of the missing team, or serving as a false lead. Patterns emerged and dissolved. Footprints vanished under drifting snow, and every fragment of evidence became a puzzle piece whose context remained frustratingly ambiguous. The searchers learned to differentiate between natural disruptions and traces of human passage, yet certainty remained elusive, and each step was taken with cautious deliberation. Vast expanses of untouched forest stretched toward distant ridgelines, the isolation magnifying every sound and shadow, turning the mundane into a potential signal of human presence. Echoes bounced unpredictably between snow-laden trees, creating false impressions of movement or distant calls. Ice-crusted rivers appeared deceptively placid, masking torrents beneath that could trap or sweep away the unwary. The scale of the Alaskan wilderness made even the most deliberate searches feel minute, leaving rescuers to grapple with a sense of insignificance in the face of such vastness. Search parties recalculated their routes repeatedly, debating whether to attempt risky climbs along icy ridges or sweep frozen riverbeds, balancing the urgency of the mission with the limits of safety. They relied on topographical intuition, prior experience and aerial imagery, yet the terrain continuously shifted beneath them. Each decision carried immediate consequences. One misstep on an icy ledge or a wrong turn through dense forest could separate an individual from the group permanently. Every choice was underscored by the haunting possibility that the missing plane and its crew might remain beyond reach. As visibility collapsed under thickening clouds and the wind sharpened its bite, the mission seemed to drift into a precarious limbo where even experienced bush pilots and trackers questioned the feasibility of success. Snow and fog merged into indistinguishable grey, blurring compass points and erasing landmarks. The team was forced to rely on estimations, patience and intuition, all while fatigue threatened clarity. The very tools and strategies that had guided them thus far were rendered unreliable, leaving rescuers at the mercy of the environment they sought to master. Ultimately, the evidence remained scattered and incomplete, the vast Alaskan expanse offering fragments of a story the searchers could never fully reconstruct, leaving uncertainty as the only certainty. Debris impressions in snow and faint metallic reflections hinted at events that might have occurred hours or days prior, yet no coherent trail connected these pieces. The sheer scale of the wilderness, combined with rapid environmental changes, meant that even the most painstaking search could fail to yield clarity, leaving an enduring sense of mystery that hung over the region long after teams returned to base. Even after days of flight and foot patrols, the Alaskan wilderness held its silence, concealing the vanished team behind an unbroken wall of snow and shadow. The Chilean mine collapse responders. The sun had barely crested the peaks of the Atacama Desert when word spread of another tragedy deep beneath the Chilean soil, a place already seared into global memory by the astonishing survival and extraction of 33 workers from the San Jose mine in 2010. That earlier collapse, which sealed men hundreds of meters below for nearly 70 days, had drawn rescuers, engineers and specialists from around the world, forging a tense collaboration that would later be celebrated as one of the most remarkable feats of mine rescue in history. In the shadow of that legacy, whispers began to circulate about a group of responders who had entered a newly caved-in shaft and then inexplicably ceased all contact, their radios fading out as if swallowed by the stony darkness itself. In August of 2010, when the San Jose mine near Copiapo collapsed without warning, the initial responders were local emergency crews who scrambled into the shattered entrance in a desperate bid to reach the silent tunnels below. Though they could do little in those first hours, their effort marked the beginning of a massive coordinated initiative that brought together Chilean authorities, drilling experts, and government agencies, all driven by a hope that shimmered as faintly as their headlamps in the subterranean gloom. The operation quickly turned into a race against time, against heat, and against the unforgiving geology that had swallowed the miners, and it was during those frantic days that the notion of rescue teams inexplicably vanishing, cut off from communication, never to be seen again, began to seep into conversations in Chile's mining camps. The San Jose disaster was deeply rooted in systemic safety failures, with investigations later finding that warnings about unstable rock had been repeatedly disregarded and that outdated tunnel maps confounded rescue drilling efforts. When the first boreholes finally pierced the earth and confirmed a faint tapping in response to probing rods, it was a miracle that electrified the world. The 33 men were alive, huddled in an emergency refuge deep underground, subsisting on dwindling rations and communicating only through the rhythm of knocks on steel. The thought that teams entering similar darkness might simply disappear without a trace, which some families and miners swore had happened during exploratory efforts in peripheral shafts, fed into a lingering sense of dread about the unknown corridors that spiderwebbed through the mountain. For weeks, crews hammered, drilled, and widened shafts that might reach the trapped men, working around the clock under blistering desert sun and in the chill of night watches. 3 separate drilling rigs, 2 high-torque raise-bore machines, and a large oil field rig, clawed at millions of pounds of rock, and as each plan progressed, operators and engineers navigated not only technical challenges, but an oppressive psychological strain that made some speak in hushed tones of tunnels that seemed to shift and breathe, of echoes that didn't belong to any human voice. Though none of the official records confirm any permanent loss of rescue personnel, the shared imagery of rescuers vanishing into twisting gallery after gallery, never to return, took on the tenor of legend among those who spent long nights beside the rigs. The arrival of experts from NASA at the San Jose site added an almost cinematic level of technical sophistication to the effort. Their guidance on nutrition, psychological care, and capsule design lending hope to an increasingly beleaguered public. Yet even with this infusion of expertise, there were moments when communication lines went silent, when drills seemed to stall for days at a time, and when the spectre of something more than rock and pressure, something unseen, seemed to block the way forward for the rescuers. Those silences were fertile soil for the more mysterious retellings, and they took on a life of their own in tales told around campfires and late-night gatherings of rig hands and geologists. The culmination of the San Jose rescue, with the specially engineered capsule lifting each miner to the surface over the course of nearly a full day, was broadcast around the world and watched by millions. It was a triumph of human will and international cooperation, and yet for some who had lived through the crisis, there remained a sense that not all of the darkness beneath had been fully illuminated. The notion that something more elusive, irretrievable, lingered within the labyrinthine tunnels fed a quiet fear that stories of vanished rescuers might have more truth in them than anyone wanted to admit. More recently, another disaster struck Chile's vast and historic El Teniente copper mine, this time triggered by a magnitude 4.2 earthquake that reverberated through the Andes and sent sections of the underground complex collapsing on dozens of workers. At El Teniente, which has more than 4,000 kilometers of tunnels stretching beneath the mountains near Rancagua, rescuers faced dense rubble and unstable rock as they sought to locate and aid trapped miners, battling aftershocks and the constant threat of further collapse. The operation drew on decades of Chilean mining experience, including veterans of the 2010 effort, yet with every metre of progress came the same gnawing silence that had so unnerved rescuers 15 years earlier. A silence that seemed to absorb sound and hope alike. In the initial days of the El Teniente rescue, teams of more than 100 personnel worked to clear debris and establish communication with workers believed to be trapped nearly a kilometre below. Despite their efforts, contact could not be made for an extended period, and the weight of that unbroken quiet was enough to make even seasoned miners uneasy. They spoke of the mine as if it were a living entity, one that watched those who dared to pierce its depths, listening with an inscrutable patience. When, after much effort, the bodies of the trapped workers were finally found and the rescue effort was brought to a somber close, officials and families alike mourned the loss. And yet those stories of unaccounted-for voices in the dark remained, as if some echo of the mine's past still whispered through its abandoned corridors. For those intimately acquainted with Chile's mining history, the drama of rescue and recovery has always been tinged with a latent dread of what lies beyond the reach of light. The very act of entering a collapsed shaft, of lowering a responder into the unknown, requires a trembling faith that not every passage leads only to rock, danger and death. It is this tension between hope and oblivion that makes the legend of vanished rescuers endure in the collective imagination of miners, engineers, and the families who wait on the surface, listening for any sound that might herald life returning from beneath. In the years since the San Jose and El Teniente tragedies, Chile has invested heavily in safety protocols, seismic monitoring and rapid response strategies designed to prevent and mitigate future disasters. But the deeper fear persists, that in the twisting tangle of underground galleries, where heavy silence reigns and the earth groans with the shifting of its plates, there could still be places where rescuers enter and never come back, their fates swallowed irrevocably by the dark. Even today, deep within the mining valleys where wind carries the scent of dust and oil, old hands speak quietly of nights when the silence felt too complete, as though the mountain itself paused to listen for something that would never return. And some say that if you stand at the edge of an abandoned shaft at midnight, you can still hear the echo of a radio signal that began but never finished its call. A voice forever lost in the stone. The darkness beneath Chile's mountains has claimed those who dared to chase it, and it has no intention of giving them back. The Welsh Mountain Night Search. A solitary crunch sounded across the frost-hardened ridge, echoing down steep gullies and amplifying the valley's profound stillness, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The night pressed cold and sharp against the slopes, and even the familiar contours of the Welsh mountains seemed transformed into alien shapes under starlight. Small rock outcrops jutted unexpectedly from the ground, while hidden gullies carved shadows so deep that the mind struggled to reconcile memory with perception. This stretch of Snowdonia had claimed hikers before, and now the valley waited, indifferent and silent, as a new search was about to begin. Cold air swept through narrow passes, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and pine, and twisting distant sounds into strange, unrecognizable echoes. Owls called intermittently from hidden trees, and the low wind over distant crags produced a metallic resonance that could be mistaken for footsteps, or perhaps a voice. The rescue team's destination was a ridge rarely traversed at night, chosen because a solo hiker had failed to return, yet the uneven terrain transformed routine progress into a constant negotiation with gravity and shadow. Each step forward was measured, deliberate, and yet weighed against a mountain that seemed to resist all human intrusion. Shadows pooled in hollows between ridges, shifting with the faint glow of stars and creating illusions of movement where none existed. Rocks that had been stable under daylight now appeared threatening, suggesting paths that might collapse or gullies that might conceal unseen dangers. The team, familiar with local topography, relied on prior maps and their experience. But even the most thorough preparation offered no immunity to the uncertainty that the night imposed. Every rustle in the underbrush and distant drip from the rocky crags drew attention, blurring the boundary between the natural and the unsettlingly unknown. Small rock slides rattled unseen scree, sending tremors through the slopes that seemed to whisper warnings the untrained ear might miss. Even trained rescuers could not fully account for the instability of the soil in these mountains, particularly after early autumn rains saturated the upper paths. Loose stones tumbled unpredictably into valleys below, startling the team and emphasizing how the land itself could become a subtle but constant adversary. The interplay of gravity, frost and shadow created a shifting labyrinth, where familiar footholds could vanish beneath a sudden slide. In the distance, the faint gleam of headlamps cut across the darkness, hinting at the presence of a search team moving deliberately through the uneven terrain. The light was small, almost fragile, as it traced the edges of steep drops and twisted hollows, marking the slow progression of human effort against the scale of the mountain. The rescuers moved methodically, calling at intervals, triangulating positions with maps and radios, yet the faint echo of their voices returned distorted, as if the valley itself were bending sound. The sense of vigilance thickened, every moment demanding full attention to avoid missteps that could become catastrophic. A river, swollen from earlier rains, gurgled and churned far below, its sound distorted by cliffs and ridges, masking other noises and confusing direction. The team noted every detail: the steep bank on the left, the barely perceptible path leading to a narrower pass, the occasional reflective sheen of ice forming on stone. Navigation required constant adjustment, and even seasoned rescuers paused to confirm bearings, aware that a single wrong turn could place them out of radio range or out of sight entirely. Nature's omnipresent unpredictability made them hyper-aware that the valley did not forgive error. Every twist of the trail seemed to conceal unseen gullies, and the valley floor opened and closed unpredictably under the dim starlight, a natural maze defying memory. Experienced volunteers relied on prior reconnaissance, yet the night distorted distance and depth, and every ridge appeared both nearer and farther than it actually lay. The unpredictability heightened anxiety, and small unremarkable sounds, a falling stone, a snapping branch, took on disproportionate significance. In this environment, every observation mattered, and yet clarity was elusive, as if the mountains themselves were holding the landscape just beyond comprehension. Intermittent radio chatter crackled faintly across the mountains, breaking the oppressive silence in bursts that arrived distorted, sometimes entirely unintelligible. Calls for location checks returned partial answers, with static masking what might have been reassurance. The uncertainty gnawed at the team, intensifying every shadow, every hesitation. Attempts to re-establish communication required retracing steps, shouting across gorges, and scanning reflective surfaces for any sign of their companions' lights. Even the most basic connection to safety felt tenuous in the face of the valley's acoustic tricks. Relying on night vision devices, GPS locators, and thermal imaging cameras, Welsh search and rescue teams compensate for darkness, yet even the most advanced tools are challenged by the steep rocky slopes and dense gorges. Volunteers frequently practice buddy checks and staggered movement patterns to maintain visual contact in poor light, but the terrain itself can interrupt lines of sight in seconds. In some areas, local topography funnels sound unpredictably, making radio signals unreliable despite high-frequency channels. These operational realities, combined with rapidly changing weather, turn each night mission into a complex puzzle where every decision carries significant risk and where even minor errors can quickly escalate into life-threatening situations. The wind carried an unsettling resonance that bounced from ridge to ridge, blending distant animal calls with the echoes of human voices, making it impossible to discern origin or proximity. A bird startled by the team's movement seemed to call from a place it could not have reached, and footsteps on loose rock returned as whispers from an unseen location. The mountainscape distorted perception, turning ordinary phenomena into sources of tension, while the rescuers pressed onward, their focus alternating between the landscape and the growing sense that they were being watched, or at least recorded, by the environment itself. On the upper slopes, the rescue team's progress slowed as treacherous footing and hidden obstacles forced them into careful, deliberate movements, each step heavier than the last. The cold seeped into joints, torches flickered in uneven wind, and even simple handholds offered little assurance. Time seemed suspended. Minutes felt like hours, and the boundary between night and an almost palpable void blurred. Every glance down a gully or across a ridge carried the weight of uncertainty, as if the terrain itself were a living challenge, responding to every human intrusion. Locals recalled previous nights in the same peaks, telling of hikers who vanished after being swallowed by the dark, leaving only questions and cold, silent trails behind. Folklore and fact entwined in these stories, with documented disappearances reinforcing the eerie reputation of certain passes and ridges. Such accounts added psychological weight, reminding even the most skilled rescuers that mountains had long histories beyond what maps and logs could capture, histories in which night could erase both human presence and memory. As dawn approached, the mountains appeared calm and indifferent, the shadows retreating but leaving behind the weight of uncertainty and the lingering absence of those who had traversed the night. Traces of activity, a single glove, a flattened patch of grass, hinted at movement but revealed nothing definitive. Observers at the base of the ridge noted the valley's silence in sharp contrast to the night's sounds, a silence that suggested the landscape had retained its secrets while returning to deceptive normality. Even after searchers retraced every path and examined every crevice, the slopes retained a quiet authority, a reminder that some corners of the world remained impervious to human efforts. Modern equipment, training, and protocols could improve safety, yet the mountains themselves remained unpredictable and unknowable. In this balance of human determination and environmental dominance, some nights left questions unanswered, and some presences unaccounted for, lingering in memory long after the wind ceased. Somewhere in the folds of ridge and hollow, the night still guards the secrets of those who never returned. The Canadian Arctic Ice Patrol. Endless sheets of white stretched to the horizon, broken only by jagged pressure ridges and distant ice cliffs, as a Canadian Arctic Ice Patrol ventured into terrain that swallowed landmarks and flattened sound. The vast expanse was almost otherworldly, a monochrome sea of frozen ridges and shifting ice, where distances distorted perception and time seemed to stretch with the emptiness. Even the faintest detail, a crack in a floe, a darker patch of snow, a reflection of pale light, demanded attention. The silence itself carried weight, reminding the team that in these latitudes, even a single misstep could have consequences that would never be witnessed. Their mission began with a call about drifting ice threatening a research station, a routine response complicated by the frigid temperatures and the remoteness of the northern archipelago. Satellite imagery had indicated thin ice in areas previously considered stable, and patrol teams were dispatched to monitor movement and ensure the safety of personnel stationed hundreds of kilometers away. The Arctic winter imposed limits on visibility and endurance, and while the team carried training and experience, no protocol could eliminate the sense of being utterly isolated in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Hidden crevasses yawned beneath deceptively smooth snow, and sudden shifts in the ice created deep fissures that could crack without warning, transforming familiar routes into lethal traps. The patrol's path was constantly reassessed as the surface betrayed illusions of solidity, with frozen layers concealing voids capable of swallowing a person or vehicle. Observers from prior expeditions had noted that even well-marked trails could vanish within hours, emphasizing the dynamic and unforgiving nature of the Arctic terrain. Every step carried calculated risk, and the team's careful pace belied the growing tension beneath layers of frost and snow. Snowmobiles were fitted with tracking devices, Team members wore insulated survival suits, and satellite phones buzzed with intermittent signals, yet every tool was subject to the Arctic's unpredictable grip. Electronics could fail without warning in sub-zero conditions, battery performance plummeting even in equipment rated for extreme cold. Thermal imaging devices, designed to detect heat through snow, were limited by blizzards or drifting ice, and even visual markers could be obscured by subtle shifts in light and wind. The team relied on redundancy and vigilance, but the Arctic offered no guarantees, only shifting indifferent surfaces and harsh, merciless conditions. Progress across the frozen sea demanded measured care, each patrol member scanning the horizon for disturbances in the ice, while listening for the faintest hints of movement. The whiteness seemed infinite, a flat plain interrupted only by pressure ridges or distant icebergs that could appear and disappear as perspective shifted. Footfalls produced hollow echoes, and every crack or groan of the ice drew immediate attention. The human presence, however carefully deployed, seemed fragile against the scale and power of the frozen world surrounding them. Large floes creaked and groaned under invisible stress, and occasional carving sent thunderous echoes across the expanse, reminding the team of the fragile stability beneath their feet. Ice that had supported the patrol moments earlier could shift without warning, separating sections into moving islands of white. The sound travelled unpredictably across the frozen surface, sometimes appearing near, sometimes far, amplifying uncertainty. Each noise was analysed for significance. Yet the Arctic remained enigmatic, masking both danger and safety with the same deceptive tranquility. Even the most advanced equipment faltered under the Arctic's relentless cold. Batteries lost charge in minutes, sensors froze, and radios sometimes transmitted only static, leaving the patrol dangerously isolated. The human body faced its own invisible threats. Fingers stiffened despite gloves, breath crystallized on gear, and every step demanded careful attention as frostbite and exhaustion silently accumulated. Team members relied on strict rotation schedules and constant monitoring of each other's condition, yet the cold amplified small mistakes, making even minor slips potentially fatal. In these conditions, survival depended not only on skill but on the vigilance required to anticipate every hidden danger the ice could present. Navigation became a constant challenge as GPS readings fluctuated and the monochrome landscape erased reference points, forcing reliance on subtle variations in ice colour and ridge formation. The horizon offered no clues, shadows were muted in polar twilight, and even distant topography appeared flattened by the overwhelming whiteness. Human perception struggled to interpret scale and distance, and every map, marker or waypoint became provisional. Maintaining orientation required continuous verification and meticulous observation, with the ever-present knowledge that a single miscalculation could have devastating consequences. Communication faltered unexpectedly. Radios emitted static or dropped entirely, leaving patrol members isolated in a world where silence was more profound than darkness. Attempts to re-establish contact were frustrated by terrain, atmospheric conditions, and the sheer emptiness around them. Even when signals returned briefly, they were fragmented and unreliable, creating gaps in coordination that heightened tension. In the Arctic, silence could be a warning, a prelude to disaster, or simply the environment asserting itself over human attempts to dominate it. Search and reconnaissance efforts became a race against subtle environmental shifts, with aerial supports scanning from above while teams attempted to track the patrol's progress on ice that seemed to move under their feet. Snowdrifts erased footprints almost as soon as they were made, and minor changes in ice elevation could mislead even experienced trackers. Attempts to triangulate positions with radios or thermal sensors were hampered by reflection, refraction, and extreme cold. The combination of scale, mobility, and environmental interference made finding any lost patrol exceedingly difficult. A sudden windstorm swept across the expanse, lifting snow into a fine haze that distorted the view and carried faint, unidentifiable sounds that unsettled even experienced rescuers. The storm reduced visibility to near zero in moments, while howling gusts amplified distant ice fractures, creating auditory illusions of approaching footsteps or breaking ice. Movement slowed to near imperceptible increments, and the patrol's progress was dictated as much by the storm as by human decision-making. The Arctic enforced patience and respect, its vastness reminding even the most skilled of human vulnerability. Historical records of Arctic patrols noted how rapidly conditions could change, leaving entire teams disoriented or stranded, and underscored the unforgiving nature of extreme northern operations. Documented incidents over decades highlighted that even well-prepared teams face sudden whiteouts, hidden crevasses, or equipment failures. Every mission carried inherent uncertainty, and cumulative experience emphasized contingency planning, redundancy, and a constant awareness of the Arctic's lethality. These facts grounded the current patrol's mysterious disappearance in a lineage of real challenges faced by Arctic rescuers for generations. Even with modern satellite communication and thermal imaging, the Arctic remained a place where human planning collided with natural unpredictability, and minor miscalculations could vanish into white emptiness. Lessons learned from past missions improved survival odds, but they could not nullify the isolation, scale, or randomness inherent to the frozen expanse. In this context, disappearance could occur without evidence, leaving only tracks quickly erased and questions that the landscape itself refused to answer. The vast whiteness concealed far more than it revealed. As the sun lingered near the horizon, casting pale light across the frozen surface, the ice seemed to reclaim every footprint and echo, a silent witness to the team's uncertain fate. The horizon stretched unbroken, monotone and unyielding, offering neither clue nor consolation. Snowdrifts shifted subtly in the faint light, and pressure ridges realigned with the current of wind, erasing traces of movement and human presence. Observers on distant ice shelves could see nothing beyond a uniform white expanse, leaving the fate of those who traversed it entirely unknowable. Somewhere beyond the horizon of frozen waves, the Arctic still holds the last traces of those who disappeared into its indifferent expanse. The New Zealand Fiordland River Sweep. The river surged with a low, constant roar, its dark waters weaving through towering beech trees as rescuers prepared to navigate currents that could erase all traces in an instant. Shadows from the forest danced across the surface, shifting with every wave and eddy, while fallen logs and rock outcroppings punctuated the otherwise continuous flow. The path would take them through narrow channels and rapid sections where a single misstep could carry both boat and personnel downstream in a matter of seconds. Even the most familiar stretches of the river could transform without warning, hiding dangers beneath deceptively smooth water. Their assignment was urgent but routine. A missing kayaker had been reported upstream, and swift channels demanded immediate assessment and precise coordination. Patrols had been dispatched along the Fiordland River before, but the combination of rugged terrain, turbulent waters, and dense canopy made every search operation complex. Local SAR coordinators emphasized that daylight hours were precious, and in regions prone to sudden rainfall and fluctuating river levels, speed was as important as caution. Every decision had to account for the river's unpredictability, and rescuers moved with a mixture of determination and wariness. Rocks and submerged logs lurked beneath the surface, forming invisible hazards capable of overturning rafts or sweeping equipment into the river's depths. Even shallow rapids could conceal jagged stone formations, their presence detectable only through subtle changes in the water's colour or flow. Floating debris and sunken branches increased the risk of entanglement, making navigation slower and requiring constant vigilance. The river seemed alive, responding to every shift in wind or rainfall, reshaping itself in ways that human planning could only partially anticipate. Inflatable boats, throw lines, waterproof radios, and thermal sensors were readied, yet each device remained vulnerable to spray, shifting water, and shadowed overhangs along the banks. Radios sometimes emitted nothing but static, and thermal sensors could be compromised by water spray or shaded pockets beneath overhanging vegetation. Paddles struck water with measured rhythm, but each stroke had to be precise, as a moment of imbalance could set a raft drifting into a treacherous channel. Despite meticulous preparation, every piece of equipment faced the relentless challenge of the river's natural forces. Progress required careful maneuvering, paddles slicing through turbulent currents, scanning eddies and inlets while signalling across rapids and listening for faint signs of movement. The constant roar of rushing water made it difficult to discern even the slightest sound of human presence, and spray from minor cascades further obscured visual cues. Each observation demanded heightened attention. A subtle ripple could indicate a submerged hazard, or a possible clue to the missing kayaker's path. The river dictated pace, forcing rescuers to adapt continuously to shifting conditions. Rain fell intermittently, slicking rocks and saturating the forest floor, while distant waterfalls sent subtle tremors that distorted both sound and perception. Visibility fluctuated with every downpour, and the surrounding forest amplified every noise, turning ordinary splashes or crackling branches into uncertain echoes. The combination of water, wind, and vegetation created a sensory environment that disoriented even the most experienced rescuers, requiring repeated recalibration of both direction and awareness. Beneath the turbulent surface, the river concealed sudden chutes and submerged whirlpools that could snatch a raft without warning. Strong currents converged in unpredictable patterns, forming pockets of force that twisted floating debris and dragged paddles downward before rescuers could react. Even small variations in water depth or riverbed slope could amplify the danger, making seemingly calm sections lethal in seconds. Rocks hidden just below the surface created sharp hazards, while underwater logs acted as invisible tripwires capable of capsizing boats. Awareness alone could not mitigate these threats. Rescuers had to anticipate the river's hidden choreography, every choice a delicate negotiation with a force that refused to reveal its full shape. Sudden shifts in the current divert rafts toward hidden shallows and debris, forcing constant adjustments in a struggle to maintain control. The river's energy was deceptive. Wide, slow sections could quickly give way to constricted, fast-moving channels, leaving little room for error. Every moment required teamwork, precise signaling, and anticipation of the river's unpredictable behavior. A single mistake could mean losing not just gear, but the faint trail that linked the searchers to the missing kayaker. Radios faltered as canyon walls bounced static and spray-obscured signals, leaving rescuers isolated amid the relentless motion of the river. Visual cues were equally unreliable. Sunlight reflected off water in blinding flashes, while overhanging branches and rain distorted the line of sight. Rescuers had to rely on practiced patterns and predetermined rendezvous points, yet even these could be thwarted by rising water levels or sudden shifts in the river. The combination of sound, shadow, and motion turned every decision into a high-stakes calculation. Along the riverbanks, fleeting clues, bent reeds, disturbed gravel, or a discarded paddle, hinted at human passage that the flowing water would soon erase. Each fragment was carefully noted, yet the river's constant motion promised that these traces would vanish almost as quickly as they were discovered. Subtle shifts in debris or sand could mislead searchers, giving the impression of presence where none existed, or hiding signs that might have revealed the missing kayaker's route. The ephemeral nature of these hints amplified tension and uncertainty. Exhaustion compounded the challenge, as the dense forest and meandering river stripped away all sense of time and orientation. Even highly trained rescuers felt the psychological strain of isolation, with gusts of wind, shifting shadows, and spray magnifying doubt and anxiety. Cold, wet conditions and continuous effort slowed reactions and dulled judgment, making each rapid more dangerous. Navigational cues were fleeting, the river and forest conspiring to obscure landmarks, leaving rescuers dependent on memory, instinct, and meticulous attention to detail to avoid disaster. Colleagues retraced the route, scanning from elevated banks and drones, yet the winding river and dense vegetation concealed nearly every trace. From above, the water seemed deceptively calm, but beneath, currents twisted unpredictably, and submerged obstacles challenged every advance. Even advanced aerial surveillance offered fleeting glimpses of hazards or debris, while light and shadow across ripples masked the true depth and speed of the river's channels. Every observation demanded careful interpretation, and every misjudgment could erase progress. Past rescue operations in Fiordland reveal that even experienced teams confront sudden surges, hidden falls, and near-freezing waters that can overwhelm anyone unprepared. Reports indicate that rivers can rise dramatically after upstream rainfall, turning gentle streams into perilous torrents in minutes. Rescue teams train for such eventualities, yet Fiordland's geography and climate consistently defy expectations. Lessons from previous incidents underscore both the necessity of preparation and the limits of human foresight when confronting forces that operate on nature's unpredictable terms. Despite GPS tracking, thermal imaging, and aerial coordination, The river's turbulence, submerged obstacles, and canopy interference rendered modern methods imperfect, leaving uncertainty intact. Even a slight misreading of coordinates could divert searchers by hundreds of meters, while moving water erased footprints and drifted equipment downstream. Thermal signatures could be hidden beneath overhanging vegetation or disturbed by rapid currents. The river, relentless in its motion, resisted observation, leaving rescuers to contend with both the environment and the unknown. As evening shadows stretched across the rippling surface, the river seemed to reclaim every mark and sound, leaving only its restless current and unanswered questions. Water churned past jagged rocks and mossy banks, carrying debris and erasing tracks, while the canopy above filtered fading light in uneven patches. Every eddy, whirlpool, and hidden channel seemed to whisper of secrets already taken from human sight. The river's flow, continuous and indifferent, promised that what had been lost would remain hidden, perhaps forever. Beneath the swirling currents and shadowed banks, the river keeps secrets no human eye has ever fully uncovered. The Italian Dolomites crevasse response. Vertical walls of limestone and ice reflected pale sunlight, casting fractured shadows across deep fissures that yawned silently in the Dolomites. Frosted peaks glimmered intermittently, while narrow ridges cut sharp contrasts against the alpine sky. The mountain's cliffs and hidden glaciers created a terrain both mesmerizing and merciless, where even minor miscalculations could become catastrophic. Winds funneled through the valleys, producing eerie whistles and sudden gusts, while distant avalanches echoed through hollow canyons. Snow dusted the upper slopes, sparkling like scattered glass, and every exposed ledge hinted at dangers concealed in shadow. The call for assistance had arrived late, summoning specialists to a sector notorious for its hidden ice chasms and unpredictable terrain. A solo climber had vanished during an ascent, leaving only disturbed snow and a faint trail of footprints leading toward the upper glacier. Local alpine authorities emphasized urgency. Crevasse edges could collapse within hours, and sudden weather shifts threatened to erase every trace. The team assembled with meticulous precision, balancing speed with caution, knowing that even a short delay could prove fatal. Each member checked not only gear but mental readiness, aware that concentration could falter under relentless environmental stress. Ropes were coiled, crampons sharpened, and ice axes readied, each item a potential lifeline against the frozen terrain. Harnesses, carabiners, and pulleys were double-checked, while thermal suits and layered clothing fought the biting cold. Every piece of equipment mattered. Any failure could turn a calculated descent into a disaster. Safety protocols were rehearsed aloud, anchors examined repeatedly, yet the unpredictable glacier beneath reminded them that preparation could never remove danger entirely. Even the familiar routes of previous rescues demanded renewed attention, as the mountains shifted subtly with every temperature change. Yawning crevasses gaped under layers of snow, their brittle edges concealing sudden drops. Ice bridges spanned some gaps, fragile and deceptive, while unseen chasms lurked just out of sight. Every step carried the risk of sudden descent, requiring painstaking precision. Shadows and reflections distorted perception, offering only fleeting clues of what lay ahead. The air itself seemed charged, the stillness masking potential movement below, and climbers advanced cautiously, aware that the mountain appeared almost sentient in its silent threats. Every movement demanded concentration. Each crampon placement or handhold could determine survival. Ropes strained under weight, anchors were tested repeatedly, and ice axes bit into frozen surfaces with deliberate force. Climbers advanced slowly, measuring every step, listening for subtle sounds of cracking ice or shifting snow. The glacier resisted observation, hiding fractures and frozen pools in deceptive patterns, forcing teams to rely on both skill and intuition. Ice textures varied unpredictably, with smooth, frozen layers sometimes overlaying hollow spaces, making each step a potential trap. The temperature of the ice added another layer of danger. Hidden meltwater pockets created slippery surfaces beneath a thin snow layer. Climbers could not rely solely on sight. Every step demanded probing with ice axes and careful pressure testing with crampons. The glacier seemed alive, subtly shifting and responding to weight, revealing or concealing hazards with almost imperceptible timing. Even cautious movements carried risk, and the team moved with slow deliberation, aware that the mountain itself dictated the rhythm of the ascent. Towering seracs loomed over the glacier, their icy pinnacles casting shifting shadows in the sunlight. Fissures etched into the ice revealed hidden weaknesses, while falling fragments signaled the potential for sudden collapse. The team navigated beneath these looming structures cautiously, aware that even a small unstable block could trigger avalanches or alter the landscape in seconds. Every glance upward reminded them that gravity and time were constant threats in this unforgiving alpine world. An unexpected wind gust tore through the canyon, dislodging ice and sending small avalanches into crevices below. Even minor slides carried enough force to sweep equipment or destabilize climbers. The sound of rushing snow amplified the sense of isolation, while the shifting terrain demanded constant recalibration of movement. Nature's warning signals became survival cues, each gust or tremor interpreted as a prompt to reconsider every foothold, anchor, and step. Echoes ricocheted unpredictably between cliffs, making distant shouts impossible to locate. Overhanging seracs distorted both sound and sight, creating illusions of safety where danger lurked. Every call and response required careful interpretation, heightening isolation and uncertainty. Climbers relied increasingly on instinct as communication faltered, testing both experience and nerves in a domain that offered no margin for error. Reflected sunlight and the play of shadows often made paths appear closer or safer than they truly were, creating illusions that could mislead even a practiced eye. Glacial movement shifted subtly beneath them, altering angles, widening fractures, and exposing new hazards. Snow bridges sagged unpredictably, and ice walls groaned under the influence of temperature changes. Even previously traversed routes demanded continuous observation and adjustment. The mountain's surface, ever-changing, resisted control, requiring constant awareness of both vertical and horizontal hazards. Subtle vibrations beneath boots and ropes became signals of hidden crevasse expansion, forcing climbers to respond with both caution and immediacy. The high altitude intensified every challenge, thinning the air and making each breath a labor. Wind chill gnawed at exposed skin, while subtle hypoxia dulled reflexes and judgment in ways that were difficult to perceive. Fatigue accumulated rapidly, and routine maneuvers required extra care to avoid slips or misplacement of equipment. The combination of cold, thin air, and mental strain created a psychological weight as formidable as the cliffs themselves, testing endurance and concentration with relentless precision. Cold seeped through clothing and layers of equipment, mingling with exhaustion and quiet apprehension. Fatigue slowed reactions, and the mind's instinctive caution was dulled by continuous effort and high-altitude thin air. Every step became physically taxing and psychologically stressful. Every decision carried amplified consequences. The interplay of cold, wind, and mental strain made climbing techniques tense and deliberate, dictated as much by survival instinct as skill. Signs of human passage were fleeting. Ice axes partially buried, footprints half erased by wind, and rope fragments appearing only to vanish under drifting snow. Observers noted subtle impressions, yet the glacier erased each trace with unrelenting speed. Misread clues could divert searchers into dangerous zones, or away from potential survivors entirely. The glacier's motion ensured that every indication of human presence was temporary, vanishing almost as quickly as it appeared. Pulley systems and rope ladders facilitated descent into narrow ice fissures, yet even meticulous techniques could be undone by hidden cracks or shifting snow. Every anchor point and belay had to be verified repeatedly, and contingencies considered for potential collapse. Climbers relied on both technology and intuition, yet the glacier's unpredictable shifts constantly tested every precaution. Skill and preparation could be overcome by subtle, invisible changes in the mountain itself. Advancing carefully, the team pressed further into the glacier, only to disappear in moments. Snow and ice shifted, erasing tracks, muffling sound and scattering visual clues. Signals were lost, ropes could no longer be traced, and every indication of human presence vanished. What moments before had been a controlled operation transformed into uncertainty, leaving only the mountain's unyielding presence and the quiet sense that something had been taken from human reach. Even the faintest signals, such as rope ends dangling over fissures or partially cleared snow from footprints, were quickly consumed by wind and ice. Glacial drift buried evidence within hours, leaving rescuers and observers with nothing but the vast, frozen expanse to interpret. The environment itself seemed to conspire in erasing every trace, emphasizing the ephemeral nature of human attempts to navigate such terrain. As shadows stretched across steep peaks, sunlight glinted off distant ice walls, highlighting both the beauty and indifferent danger of the mountains. Snow bridges trembled with unseen pressure, and glacial fissures seemed to deepen in shadow, as if the landscape itself was shaped to conceal what had passed. Every cliff edge and frozen slope reflected light differently, creating a kaleidoscope of deceptive angles. In this environment, even experience offered no certainty, and the mountains held their secrets with a patience that outlasted human vigilance. Among twisting ice chasms and silent cliffs, the Dolomites conceal the vanished searcher's fate in a stillness that no human voice can breach. The California wildfire evacuation turnaround. Flames licked the edges of dry chaparral as the search and rescue team entered the canyon, unaware that shifting winds would soon turn their path into a perilous maze. Smoke curled upward in thick tendrils, bending unpredictably in the afternoon heat. The scent of scorched earth and resin-filled pine filled the air, clinging to clothing and lungs. Fire crews had warned that the blaze was unpredictable, yet the terrain's narrow canyons and steep embankments made the operation almost impossible to navigate. Every movement required constant vigilance, as even a momentary lapse could send a person tumbling into unseen danger. Thick smoke hung like a curtain over ridgelines, distorting vision and swallowing the sound of distant sirens, making every step a cautious gamble. Shadows twisted in the haze, creating illusions of safe ground where none existed. The team relied on GPS and radio signals, but interference from heat distortion and topography rendered navigation uncertain. The roar of distant flames blended with wind whistles, leaving a sense that the canyon itself was alive and shifting. Even experienced responders felt disoriented, their eyes scanning constantly for subtle cues hidden beneath the smoke's grey veil. Gear was checked for the final time: heat-resistant suits, infrared goggles, radios that crackled intermittently, each item a potential lifeline against a fire that obeyed no rules. Water packs and portable oxygen masks were distributed, while gloves were reinforced to prevent burns from unexpected embers. Every tool had been carefully selected for both speed and protection, yet the team understood that no amount of preparation could eliminate the fire's capricious nature. Radios were tested again, but static hissed through the channels, hinting that communication might falter when it was most needed. Without warning, a flare shot through a cluster of oak trees, embers spiraling into the air and forcing the team to retreat several meters to avoid sudden injury. The heat intensified as nearby shrubs ignited, crackling like miniature explosions. One firefighter narrowly avoided a falling branch, its base consumed by fire and weakened to the point of collapse. Each second stretched into eternity, and every movement had to be calculated with extreme precision. The canyon's twists and turns amplified the sounds, making it impossible to gauge how far danger truly lay ahead. Narrow trails carved into the canyon walls funneled both smoke and panic, leaving little room for maneuver as steep slopes threatened to turn missteps into disaster. Loose soil and ash coated the paths, reducing traction and making every step precarious. One misjudged foot placement could slide a responder down a slope into unseen obstacles. Even the most confident climbers slowed their pace, adjusting their weight and grip constantly. The fire's unpredictability forced split-second decisions on which routes were safe, and every choice carried consequences that could be felt immediately. Visibility dropped further when a sudden gust funneled smoke from uphill, muffling voices and leaving team members relying on instinct rather than direction. Hand signals replaced shouts, though even gestures were difficult to discern in the dense haze. Heat shimmered in the air, distorting shapes and creating mirages of non-existent paths. Despite careful training, the team experienced a creeping sense of vulnerability, each responder aware that one wrong step could separate them from both safety and one another. The canyon had become a labyrinth with invisible walls, defined only by the dangers that could strike at any moment. Families and evacuees moved alongside the team, their anxiety palpable, heightening every decision and forcing leaders to balance speed with safety under relentless pressure. Children clutched parents' hands tightly while older residents stumbled along the trails, slowed by both fear and exhaustion. The rescuers became guides in both physical and psychological senses, interpreting signals from the fire and maintaining morale under stress. Every decision now involved not just the team's survival, but the lives of those they escorted, amplifying the weight of responsibility with every uncertain step. Ash drifted in the hot wind, swirling around boots and gloves, while glowing embers ignited isolated pockets of brush in ways that seemed both random and menacing. The smell of smoke burned at the back of throats and stung eyes, forcing rapid blinking and irritation. Heat waves shimmered along the canyon floor, distorting the terrain and creating illusions of firm footing where none existed. The team pressed forward carefully, each movement deliberate, calculating how far they could push themselves before nature's unpredictability overtook human skill. Sudden fire whirls, small rotating columns of flame and ash erupted along the canyon floor, catching even experienced rescuers off guard and forcing them to adjust routes in real time. These fiery eddies moved unpredictably with shifts in wind, igniting brush in isolated pockets and leaving scorching streaks across previously safe paths. The heat radiated intensely, warping the air and creating mirages that distorted distances and depth perception. Even infrared devices struggled to distinguish hazards from illusions, and every second required split-second judgment to avoid burns, entrapment, or separation from the group as the fire reshaped the landscape around them. The fire surged unexpectedly along a ridge, cutting off planned escape routes and pushing the team into a maze of canyons where familiar landmarks vanished beneath the haze. Crews attempted to find alternate paths, but smoke and flames obscured everything beyond a few meters. The wind shifted again, sending embers swirling down slopes where the team had just passed, marking their previous route with fresh danger. Anxiety crept into every thought, and even seasoned responders questioned whether the canyon could be crossed safely. Every familiar sensation was rendered deceptive by heat, light, and smoke. Decisions had to be made instantly, whether to retreat, reroute, or risk crossing a fragile embankment, each choice potentially determining who would survive the day. Radios picked up fragments of chatter from distant teams, but signals were inconsistent and often meaningless. One wrong choice could strand the team in an isolated pocket where fire could circle and close every escape route. Even with extensive experience, the combination of speed, visibility, and shifting fire patterns created an environment where uncertainty was constant and absolute. Exhaustion set in quickly, lungs burned from smoke, legs cramped from steep terrain, and the relentless sun intensified the weight of both heat and responsibility. Sweat soaked through protective clothing, mixing with ash and soot, while dehydration tugged at focus and coordination. Each step required more effort than the last, and the mental strain grew alongside physical fatigue. The canyon became a test not just of skill, but of endurance, as heat, fire, and responsibility combined into an almost unbearable pressure. When the smoke briefly cleared, scattered footprints led to nothing, radios emitted only static, and even the most experienced responders seemed swallowed by the chaotic landscape. The temporary visibility revealed scorched terrain and paths abruptly ending in blackened soil. Equipment left moments ago appeared gone or consumed by the fire, and attempts to re-establish contact failed repeatedly. The canyon offered no clues, only ambiguity and the unsettling sensation that human presence was fleeting against the consuming blaze. Evidence of their passage was minimal: scorched earth, disrupted branches, and a faint trail of ash that vanished into shadows, leaving observers with nothing concrete to explain their disappearance. Every mark the team left was either consumed by smoke, wind, or fire, emphasizing the ephemeral nature of human intervention in such extreme conditions. Search crews could only follow traces that were gone as quickly as they appeared, amplifying the mystery of how trained responders could seemingly vanish without a trace in familiar terrain. Police systems, ropes, and emergency signaling devices were deployed where possible, but each attempt to navigate or communicate seemed undone by smoke and wind. Even well-rehearsed safety procedures faltered under extreme conditions. The fire's power rendered technology unreliable, and the canyon itself reshaped the environment with every passing gust. Human coordination was tested to the limit, and the disappearance of the team became a puzzle against a backdrop of chaotic natural forces. The scorched canyons held no trace of the team, only the faint whisper of heat and shadow where their presence had vanished without a trace. The Andes' high-altitude retrieval that fell silent. A faint signal from a mountaineering distress beacon had drawn the rescue unit to the jagged Andes ridge, but the coordinates seemed almost too precise, as if the mountain itself had lured them into its maze. The missing climbers were reported trapped near a narrow ice funnel several thousand meters above sea level, a location notoriously difficult for even the most seasoned high-altitude teams. The climbers had attempted to descend after a sudden storm swept through their peaks, but shifting snow and hidden crevasses blocked every known route. Each member of the rescue squad understood that reaching them would require careful navigation, precise timing, and extraordinary endurance, yet none anticipated that their own mission could dissolve into the same silence they sought to escape. Each step demanded careful calculation, not only to navigate steep rock faces but also to conserve energy in air so thin that every breath felt like a battle against the altitude. Frost clung to eyelashes and clothing, and the icy ground seemed to absorb every ounce of effort, making even the simplest movement a test of balance and stamina. The terrain alternated between brittle rock and snow-slicked ledges, and a single slip could send someone plummeting into a crevasse. Footfalls required constant adjustment, and even as the team pressed forward, fatigue began to weave itself into their muscles and minds, making judgment slower and movements more tentative. The mountain's verticality allowed no margin for error, and progress was measured in cautious inches rather than strides. Oxygen masks hissed intermittently as the team adjusted their flow rates, balancing the need for mobility with the life-sustaining air that could falter at any moment. Occasionally a mask would fog or shift under a helmet strap, causing brief panic as the rescuer struggled to breathe efficiently while maintaining grip on an ice axe. Cylinders clinked faintly in the wind, a reminder that each inhalation was borrowed and limited. Even as they moved carefully, they could hear the distant groan of shifting ice and the soft scrape of rockfall, sounds amplified and distorted by the high valleys around them. The mask muffled their voices, forcing reliance on hand signals, short gestures, and the occasional shouted word carried uncertainly through the altitude-thinned air. Snow bridges and hidden crevasses punctuated the climb, their silent threat masked by pristine white surfaces that concealed the fissures beneath. The team sometimes probed with extended poles, watching closely for subtle give or unusual sound, knowing that a collapse could occur without warning. Every bridge required testing with ice axes before committing weight, a procedure that felt like crossing fragile glass. Some steps collapsed under the team's careful probing, leaving gaps just wide enough to force leaps or delicate pivots. The mountains seemed to measure their confidence and patience, presenting hazards only visible once they were nearly upon them, a test that demanded skill, calm, and constant attention. Radios transmitted bursts of static, and even short-range signals twisted through the canyon walls unpredictably, leaving team members to rely on pre-planned coordination and intuition. Messages sometimes cut out mid-word, creating moments of tension as teammates had to infer the meaning, adding mental strain to already exhausting physical effort. Commands became cryptic as words scattered in the wind, distorted and delayed, forcing split-second judgment calls. Even simple check-ins were misinterpreted, leaving the squad to navigate both physical obstacles and the subtle mental challenges of isolation. Communication was a lifeline, yet here it was unreliable, adding a creeping uncertainty to each step upward. Muscles burned, lungs tightened, and the strain of carrying rescue equipment on near-vertical inclines tested both physical endurance and mental fortitude. Each movement felt multiplied, as if the thin air increased gravity itself, and rescuers became acutely aware of the fragile equilibrium between momentum and exhaustion. Every rope, crampon, and oxygen tank weighed heavily not just on the body but on the mind, a constant reminder that each movement could lead to disaster. Even minor miscalculations demanded immediate correction, while exhaustion made each action more deliberate and less fluid. Awareness narrowed to the terrain beneath their feet, the rhythm of breaths, and the faint beacon signal that pulsed steadily ahead. A sudden gust sent tiny flakes of ice scattering across the faces of the rescuers, and shadows shifted across the ridges as clouds rolled in, altering perception and turning familiar ledges into deceptive slopes. The team noted how shadows could exaggerate angles, making solid ground appear steep or hollow gaps seem solid, forcing continuous reassessment. The interplay of light, snow and rock made depth judgment treacherous, and the team had to slow their progress to reassess each step. Crevices, previously visible, became masked by drifting snow, and even well-marked paths seemed to vanish in the shifting shadows. The mountain's harsh geometry demanded constant vigilance, a relentless test of attention and resolve. Decisions unfolded with mounting pressure. Continue toward the beacon or retreat to safer ground, each choice made under a sky where weather could change within minutes. Some slopes were passable, but clouds hinted at an approaching storm, threatening to trap the team at high altitude. Hesitation could be fatal, yet rushing increased the risk of slips or collapses. Each leader's decision carried immense weight, and every hesitation drew the rescuers further into the uncertainty of the mountain's silent judgment. The constant balance of urgency and caution left little room for error and no room for hesitation. One rescuer paused as a faint sound echoed from below, a subtle snap of ice or rock, reminding them that the environment could hide dangers far more immediate than distance or exhaustion. The sound could have been a falling rock, a collapsing cornice, or simply the echo of wind in a nearby ravine. Uncertainty intensified as eyes scanned every ridge and snowdrift, and the team collectively slowed, hearts pounding against the thinned air. The sound, whether real or imagined, amplified the fragile tension of the mission, where perception and reality blurred at extreme altitude. Routes previously deemed secure began to feel fragile under shifting snow and rock, forcing improvisation at every step and emphasizing the razor-thin margin for error. Rope anchors were repositioned, crampons driven into uncertain ice, and snow bridges probed continuously. The rescuers moved cautiously, constantly evaluating both terrain and stamina. Each adjustment required full concentration, with the knowledge that a lapse, even for a heartbeat, could send a member into a crevasse or over a ledge. Here, instinct intertwined with technical skill in a delicate balance, where every movement carried weight beyond the physical. Isolation set in, the team members separated by fleeting glimpses across ridges and valleys, and the constant struggle to maintain orientation amplified the tension in every movement. Even when a teammate was in sight, clouds and shadows distorted distance, and the team relied on intuition, memory, and subtle hand signals to remain coordinated. Each moment of separation heightened awareness, with adrenaline and oxygen deprivation intensifying both fear and decision-making. The rescue was no longer just a retrieval, it had become a test of endurance, focus, and survival in a world defined by extremes. Evidence of their passage disappeared quickly, footprints obliterated by gusts, equipment dusted with snow, and oxygen canisters left as silent markers in an otherwise undisturbed expanse. Every trace of human presence vanished within minutes, swallowed by wind and drifting snow. Small details, an abandoned rope swinging from a ridge, a glint of metal on ice, or a faint scent of fuel, were fleeting reminders that the team had been there at all. With each step forward, they left only ghostly impressions that the mountain erased almost immediately, a reminder that memory itself could be swallowed by the cold. The beacon continued to pulse faintly, but with each beat the team's presence seemed to vanish into the high-altitude emptiness, leaving no clue whether they were advancing or already lost. The light on the ridge was the only confirmation of movement, yet the team's outlines were obscured in drifting snow and shadow. Even skilled mountaineers could not reconcile the beacon's seeming precision with the chaotic, silent environment around them. The Andes peaks remained indifferent, a vast expanse claiming all who ventured too far without leaving answers, and each pulse of light became a haunting reminder of the unknown. Above the icy ridges and silent crags, the missing rescuers faded from sight, leaving only the relentless, indifferent Andes and the faint, unanswered pulse of a beacon.